everybody, what's going on? Welcome back to another exciting installment of the Arcane Archive presents MetaTalks. Me and Sam are back here today to bring you another incredible topic. Sam, as always, why don't you go ahead and tell the people, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about like ability scores and the different skills that go along with it. Kind of how they're meant to be implemented, how we like to use them. Just kind of going over the little bit of the rules on that as well. I think sometimes people like to forget maybe the nitty-gritty for each thing, so it's nice to kind of go over and look at what they're meant to be used for, what we like to use them for at a table.
Yeah. So you know, in essence, we're basically just going to be talking today, similarly as kind of in some of our previous videos. As always, we're going to kind of just rant and rave a little bit about how, you know, things are kind of maybe meant to be used, how we feel maybe these things are usually used in our experience, and how we feel maybe these things should instead be used in certain instances or ways. But first, obviously, we'll kind of give you the rundown, mechanically speaking, on what these attributes / stats and their corresponding skills, as well as their saves, are actually, like, you know, meant to do in the game based off of, you know, the text and everything. But yeah, with that said, let's go ahead and get right on into it. Starting off, as you do, this simply makes the most sense. I think this is a stat that everybody loves near and dear to their hearts, especially depending on what class you play, and that is going to be the strength stat. Strength. Here, second. Strength is the measure of your bodily power, your athletic training, and the extent to which you can exert raw physical force. Strength checks, all corresponding strength checks, which I believe is only technically athletics. A strength check can model any attempt to lift, push, pull, or break something, to force your body through a space, or to otherwise apply brute force to any kind of situation. The athletic skill reflects aptitude in certain kinds of strength checks. Athletics. Your strength athletics checks covers difficult situations you encounter while climbing, jumping, or swimming. Examples include the following activities. You attempt to climb a sheer or slippery cliff, avoid hazards while scaling a wall, or cling to a surface while something is trying to knock you off. You try to jump an unusually long distance or pull off a stunt mid-jump. You struggle to swim or stay afloat in treacherous currents, storm-tossed waves, or areas of thick seaweed. Or another creature tries to push or pull you underwater or otherwise interfere with your swimming. There are, of course, other instances throughout the game that a DM or GM might call for a specific kind of strength check. Such as, you know, when you're trying to force open a stuck, locked, or barred door, break free of bonds, push through a tunnel that is too small, hang onto a wagon, so on and so forth. It also does happen to have, if you play a particular type of game that utilizes like encumbrance, as well as if you like your character itself is trying to like lift or carry certain things. Your strength score is the score that determines the amount of weight you can bear. Shocker, shocker. The following terms define what you can lift or carry. Your carrying capacity is specifically your strength score multiplied by 15. So again, to be specific about that, it is your overall score, like whatever number it is based off of, like, if it's a 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, instead of it being your modifier. So that's important to remember, is that it's specifically your strength score multiplied by 15, and this is the weight in pounds that you are able to carry, which is high enough that most characters don't usually have to worry about it. So
unless you're carrying, you know, large amounts of metal, or
if you have like a ton of like gold, like, you know, if you have like 50,000 gold pieces, like that might start to happen.
No, you don't use coin weight.
No, screw that. It's absolutely garbage. Honestly, encumbrance itself is one of the most annoying aspects of a game, or particular aspects of a game, depending on what you're trying to do, in my opinion. Like, again, I feel like there are some ways, and like I said, everything within reason. Even if you don't use encumbrance, the fact that you're like, oh, you get to carry 50,000 coins, gold coins, it's like, that might be a little ridiculous. You might have to just go about, you know, spreading it out more evenly among, like, you know, platinum, silver, and copper as necessary. But the other aspect for your strength score that determines is your push, drag, or lift Capability. You can push, drag, or lift a weight in pounds up to twice your carrying capacity or 30 times your strength score. While pushing or dragging weight in excess of your carrying capacity, your speed drops to 5 feet. You also have your strength score is also the thing directly tied to, say, your jumping distance in the game. I believe how it is it's basically like you can jump as long as you get a 10-foot head start, you can jump like 2 times your strength score. So whatever your strength score is, or so you can jump that amount of feet of your strength score. So like you can jump like if your strength score is 15, you can jump 15 feet. If your strength score is 12, you can jump 12 feet if you get a 10-foot running head start. I believe for and that's specifically for like horizontal jumps, like where you were running and jumping like forward. Although in my opinion, I also feel like you still technically can jump up.
Yeah, long jump is you can jump your strength score.
Yeah.
So
and then high jumps, like just jumping vertically, you specifically it's your modifier times what, like 3?
It's your modifier plus 3.
Plus 3 divided by like 2 or something, right?
No.
Just plus 3. Perfect. Yeah, so it is your modifier plus 3. So if your modifier for strength, if you have like a 16, it would be like 3.
So 6 feet.
So it'd be 6 feet. You could jump straight 6 feet in the air, just vertically straight up.
I believe if you get a running start, that can change things, but it's
so there are, if at any point during a game, which I'm sure it will come up, in terms of needing to lift something, needing to jump a distance, there are a lot of more like nitty gritty specific mechanics and rule aspects to it overall, all specifically tied to your strength, which is interesting because obviously if you look just straight up like at your skills list, your strength only ever has a skill for athletics, but meanwhile your strength actually does apply to a lot of these other aspects of the game that you may not actually be aware of initially. And like from my experience, Sam, well, first, why don't you say something? So like, what in your experience as you have played, like how often do you feel like strength-based checks or certain checks that you feel like either do require strength or maybe don't require strength or could be like interchangeable with another skill have kind of come up in your experience?
Something that we don't really touch upon when we're thinking about strength is specifically, I do love the use of like athletics for the stat of like being able to run long distances at full speed. It doesn't come up a lot in a lot of games, but if you're chasing after somebody or you're on foot for a long period of time and you're not moving at a normal speed, you're trying to move at a fast speed, I actually like having athletics as that skill. I know some characters, you'll build a character, you'll be like, well, I'm dex based, and so you'll take acrobatics and you'll take those things. You're like, why can't I run forever? And I'm like, because you can't just run forever if you're live. There has to be a backbone there. There's been arguments at my table whether or not Constitution can factor into that.
I think that could make sense in terms of stamina.
For me, I like having it be athletics, so I actually like that strength has a skill associated with it.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the thing is that strength checks, they happen occasionally. Part of me is like, yeah, I want them to happen more with more big, strong characters doing stupid things. But the reality is that the further along you get playing, it just doesn't work anymore.
You have things less like and less necessary.
Yeah, you have things
unless, like grappling is about.
Yeah, I mean, you have grappling is a big one, which also uses athletics.
Yeah.
But it's eventually you're gonna have things like magic that are just going to kind of
supplement the need for
dethrone the need for raw strength.
To a certain extent.
If you're playing a barbarian and you have 20 strength and you're raging or you're doing, you're going to be using strength to do things. And I have in the middle of fights done things like pin things down or push people off buildings and shit like that. And it's great.
No. I mean, I was going to say, like, one of the barbarian characters in a campaign I'm playing currently, like he grapples everything constantly. Like that's one of like his big thing. He loves to grapple stuff. And like in my experience, like it's been the stat of strength, like obviously unless you are playing a character that does specifically require strength as like its like attack and damage stat, you know, it is much more rare to come up in a lot of way. Like even strength saving throws, which are usually applied to, you know, any kind of situation or effect that is attempting to like move you or restrain you or anything in that kind of way, like for you to break free of or resist like movement. Because even then sometimes certain saving throws that you think would require that actually are con saves, which goes back to kind of what you were saying before about like, you know, con and strength almost being interchangeable in certain situations about, you know, because a lot of people associate constitution being able to like physically resist something with your constitution.
Yeah.
But I would also argue that strength could also technically be in a similar vein and could be used in a similar kind of way.
I think if you're doing something more homebrew with saving throws, I could definitely see some of the con saves being strength saves, but the reality is most of the stuff that you're going to come across, at least in 5e, when it's a con save, the reason it's a con save is because anything with that similar attribute is also a con save. I think strength saves, you don't have many of them. It's more strength. It's funny because you're either using strength to grapple or get out of grapples unless you're very dexterous.
Yeah.
So it's like usually it's just two strong people doing strong stuff.
Yeah, because like a grapple check is a contested skill check rather than it being one person trying to save from it.
It's a contested check, which is fun. I do love those.
I like it too, you know, where it's like,
but it's one of the only contested skill checks aside from like a perception stealth check.
Yeah, like it's one of the few that you actually have two creatures actively like basically combating or putting their skills against one another or testing their skills against one another, which is always fun and interesting, and definitely a bit different from some of like I'm inflicting an effect on you that you have to attempt to resist in some way.
Yeah, which I think makes sense more than having it as a save.
Yeah.
There's some monsters that'll grapple you, and it's just if it hits, you're grappled. If you wanted to change something like that, you could have contested strength checks be an option. The reality is for strength, I love the stat from the fact of like I'm a big strong guy. I smash stuff is a fun thing to be able to do. I would say most of the characters I build not very strength reliant.
Me neither.
Because unfortunately, Dex is a loaded skill with a lot of a loaded stat with a lot of skills associated with it, and strength has one skill associated with it. Technically, two if you want to say grappling and athletics.
Yeah,
those are the only two things that strength is really related to. Because the only way to grapple is to use your athletics. There is no dex grapple. There's only a dex
grapple. You can't
avoiding grapple.
Yeah, you can only acrobatics out of it. But you know what? On that topic, why don't we go ahead and shift over kind of to the next attribute on our list, which is indeed many people in the community widely laud this as being basically this is the super stat, right? This particular stat is probably the stat that gives you the most, like if not the most amount, the most important like bonuses, supports and application in the entire game to everything that you will do like well, and that stat is Dexterity.
Yeah.
Dexterity. Go ahead, bud.
Yeah. Dexterity measures agility, reflexes, and balance. Now, this also affects your initiative. This affects
your AC.
Your AC if you're wearing light or medium armor.
Yep.
And just your base AC if you are not wearing any armor.
Armor, yeah. If you're just this is just your genuine ability to be like to dodge out of the way, to not get hit by attack rolls and stuff like that.
It is your dip, duck, dive, and dodge ability, and it is awesome. It also, like strength, is a weapon attack skill.
Yep.
Usually with finesse weapons. But I believe it's just finesse weapons that you can use dex, right? Or is it?
Yeah. As long as they have the finesse, they don't have to be light specifically. It's just like as long as they have the finesse tag, you are able to apply your dex to it, as opposed to having to be just your baseline strength.
Yeah, and
Dex as well for skills, they have, I believe,
a lot.
yeah, well, they've got, in terms of just skills, they technically only have three, excuse me.
But they're
They've
good
got
ones.
acrobatics, which we talked briefly about in regards to strength before. They have sleight of hand, which again can be absolutely highly applicable in many situations and instances. And finally, stealth, which everybody in your party, even regardless of what their class, background, their race are probably going to attempt to use pretty frequently overall.
Stealth is important unless you never want to hide from something.
And take it from
believe
us,
me,
there's plenty of things that you want to hide from in this
unless
game.
you're me and you build some characters with just zero stealth and negative stealth, big
I
heavy
mean,
armor where you just
even
suck.
even then, you still do make stealth checks where it's like there's no reason to at least not try. You know what I mean? Like you're gonna be horrible at it, but it's not as if it hurts anything to ever try to stealth, because that it can give you plenty, depending on obviously the campaign you're part of. Stealthing can give you a ton of great bonuses and advantages should you successfully be able to like sneak up on any kind of situation or encounter.
Not being able to be heard or seen by things that are trying to kill you is a huge plus. If you're me, and here's a little trick of the trade, technically, if you make someone fly in heavy armor, they don't make as much noise.
I would agree. Like technically speaking, they probably would still make like, you know, a little bit of clanging as they're like kind of moving through gravity and whatnot, but
they're no longer stepping on the ground.
They're no longer walking on solid surfaces that will automatically make things echo much more.
But the thing with Dex is that it's considered a very efficient skill, or a very efficient attribute. It gives you good points in multiple aspects of a campaign, both in combat with things like your AC or initiative, as well as with stealth and sleight of hand, which is more of an out of combat or before combat scenario. Those are things that are just helpful. Yeah. Having a dexterous character is fun. I'm always that, if I'm making a fighter, half the time, or like more than half the time I make a melee class, it's Dex as opposed to strength.
No, I agree. Like, although I like strength-based fighters and of course barbarians too, but like even like the fact that Dex itself, like there are plenty of things in this game that require dexterity saving throws. Yeah. For instance, unlike strength, as we said before, far more things require Dex saves. In my opinion, like any kind of, let's say, like exploding effect where you have a bomb, a fireball, any like a rock coming down to crush you in some way. Although I would say, in my opinion, though, but technically speaking, usually that would be considered a Dex save. But I would even say that a person could potentially also use strength to, like, you know, maybe even crash into that rock head on and like shatter it or resist it rather than having to like dodge out of the way of it. But yeah, that is far more like homebrew rather than the actual technical, you know, intended stat to use. Dex, as we said at the beginning, like it is considered to be like the uber god stat. Like any class who takes, like, almost Dex will apply to almost any class that, if not all classes that you play, and will always be helpful if you have a high number in it. Like no matter what, like Sam said, it applies to your initiative, which will always be helpful. It's the thing that allows you to act first in any kind of like high stakes or intense encounter / situation. It will always apply to your armor class, so long as you're not wearing heavy armor. So obviously if you're like a strength build and you want to wear like heavy armor, Dex wouldn't really be applicable then. But again, and almost even then it still helps because your Dex saves, so many things require Dex saves. That's great. Your stealth, sleight of hand, acrobatics, it applies to so much. You can do so much with it. It is probably the most diverse of all the attributes to any character. And obviously, you know, your stealth-based classes are the rogue, the bard, warlock, ranger. Yeah, monk. Yeah, you cannot go wrong usually with having like a high score in Dex, no matter what you're doing. Yeah. As opposed, obviously, strength. You know, your strength-based classes are primarily fighter, barbarian, paladin, cleric to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, depending on which cleric you're playing.
Yeah, I mean, even most clerics, is like most of the melee weapons that they would use if they're going to would most likely be more strength based, because they'll also be wearing, you know, heavier armor usually.
Which is that's an important thing we didn't touch upon. Strength is required for heavy armor.
It is. You need well that comes back into play of like your carrying capacity, right? It's a similar basically thing as like the higher your strength, the more you can carry. And once again, depending on the game you're playing, that isn't necessarily as like relevant or necessary if you don't use like, you know, a lot of encumbrance rules, if you're not really into like keeping track of the minutia of all of the shit that you're carrying.
I mean, I'm a big proponent of, if you want to invest in heavy armor, you need to have the minimum strength requirement, which is 13.
I would agree.
I think what, 13 to 14. I think 14 is full plate.
I think it's basically a similar thing of like depending on like, you know, if you like in the if you also instigate class requirements, right? If you're going to like hybrid class or multi-class, you have to have certain attribute requirements to then become this other class, which is basically the same as like heavy armor. You have to have a certain baseline amount of strength. Or
I think it's fair. Because honestly,
I would agree. I don't think you should just be
lugging yourself around in heavy armor all day is not fun, especially if you have a 10 in strength. You're not gonna be able to do it. And so to get, I think it's an important thing to put out there is strength does have its uses, and that's because my deck sucks and I want to wear big heavy armor.
Yeah. And you know, and we'll just to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. It's like in regard to that, like I also feel like some people though, like I feel like put a bit too much emphasis on like the actual number of whatever your stat is. Like I played in games before where it's like I played more of a deck character and my dump stat was strength because it just wouldn't be really as applicable for my character in terms of what he could do and what he would be doing and be good at. And so like his I think strength stat is like 8, right? And that would be technically a -1 to any strength checks that I would make. But I often feel people are like, oh, if you have like a 10 or lower than a 10 in strength, like your character is like dilapidated. You know, your character is like super scrawny and just weak and like can barely even lift up like a teacup or whatever. You know what I mean? Where I'm like, it's not as if like they're like having an 8 in strength makes them like a mummified corpse. You know, your muscles haven't atrophied. You know, you're just probably not as like good at utilizing and keeping up, you know, certain strength-based exercises or instances as others. Because again, you can still roll high and have that capacity to roll high, even if it would be a -1. So you can still pull off some pretty decent feats of strength and stuff. And that's the point, in my opinion, of rolling in the game, is that
because I mean we're in a fantasy world. 10 strength is the average, right? Now keep in mind a lot of these people who have 10 strength are your peasant folk, farmers, fishmongers, butchers, people that work with their hands, because that is the kind of fantasy realm that this is supposed to be set in unless you change it yourself. So the average strength in D&D, I would say, is above average for where we live in the real world, because most people are not very strong unless you work with your hands or on your feet or you lift things for a living. If you work in an office, you're probably not average strength unless you do stuff outside of that. So I think saying, oh, you have a 9 or an 8, you're dilapidated. No, I have a -1.
Yeah, it's
because I'm less strong than a farmer.
That's it. You know, and subsequently, on the other hand, it's like, hey, yeah, if it's like, oh, you have a barbarian who has a strength score of 20, like that,
you're superhuman.
That is superhuman. Like you are twice as strong as the normal person.
That's like you're like the world's strongman competitors, like those Icelandic dudes that can like lift a truck. Like that's you.
Any kind of like, you know, CrossFit, you know, like professional weightlifter. Like you are basically there. And I would even say like you don't necessarily have to look like that per se. Like your character with a strength of 20 doesn't have to be super muscle up, like just like, you know. Because I would even say we could even just say it augments it. It's a magical, imaginary world. Magic literally suffuses and permeates every aspect of everything in this world.
Well,
go ahead.
Let's use Bandit, the 1/8 CR monster Bandit. Let's go over its stats real quick. 11 strength, so a +0.
It's
12 dex,
slightly above average, but without
+1. +1 to dex, +1 to con, +0 to intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. They are slightly stronger, if not exactly as strong as a normal human being.
Yeah.
just a little bit hardier and a little bit more dexterous than a completely average person.
Yeah.
That like
By,
the,
you
the
know, at least by the game standards and what it technically sets, you
yeah.
know.
So
Like,
I mean, you have to look at it that way. Obviously, things change for your personal characters and stuff.
I mean, I would even also put forth, to be fair, and honestly, I feel like maybe the fact that like a 10 is technically considered like the average for anybody, I feel like maybe that should not be the case. I feel like the average, you know, commoner slash farmer, whatever, I feel like their ability score should probably be more along the lines of being in like an 8 or a 9 or maybe like a 7 or 6, right? Because technically speaking, you as a character, right? Your player character, you are above average. The fact that you have gotten class, you have a class now.
Yeah, you're
Like
already
that is not a normal thing. That's why we say like commoners, farmers, like they don't have actual classes. Anybody who has like what could be considered like a character class has
or
now
just
already,
abilities. Yeah.
yeah, or has already like they have trained, they have worked, they have attained this thing even at level 1 to be up and beyond even the average person at this point. That already makes you above average right there, even regardless technically of your attributes. Now, that being the case, I personally usually do say, like in my games, I'm like, commoners don't have like, you know, just a baseline like scores of like 10. I usually give them between like, you know, 8s and like 7s to 9s and 6s depending, you know, because it's like any character usually, if you just do like point buy or standard array, you will never have anything below like a 10 depending. You can have,
You have
an
I think with point buy you can have an 8 if you want to
well,
max out something else.
point buy, you don't. Well, that's what I mean. With point buy, you don't even have to have 8s. Like you could like average everything out to be 10 at the very lowest and above to have like no minuses. You won't have probably anything that's like super great unless again you very deliberately do stuff. But with standard array, I think it does go down to 10 or 8 as being the lowest stat.
8 is the lowest for standard.
Yeah. And so that being the case, it's like you have, in my opinion, at 8, I think that would be considered an average kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I mean, you're still like you can still do things. It's not like you can't lift
that's what
stuff.
I mean.
It's not like you can't.
You should still be able to do shit. You just are not as proficient as some other people would be who are actually good at this thing.
I like to think of it as it takes a little bit more effort, because
There
I
you
would say
go. Exactly.
I would say the average person. I'm going to use a real world example, at least for around where we live. Snow is an issue. You have to buy bags of salt.
Yeah.
Or sandbags if your car is too light and you don't have purchase on icy roads. Now, those sandbags are usually about 50 to 80 pounds. 80 pounds are like the really big ones. Same thing with salt bags. You get like a 25 to 50-pound bag of salt. I would say the average person can at least lift that 50-pound bag of salt.
Yeah, 50
or
pounds
sand and move it.
At least for a certain period of time and with enough,
But if you're, for example, my significant other has to move that bag of salt up 3 flights of stairs and down 3 flights of stairs every season because she can't keep it in her car all year because it's bad for your suspension. Right. So she probably could do it, and I've seen her do it, but it takes her a lot longer than it takes me.
Yeah,
but we're both completely able to do it.
Yeah,
just one of us doesn't.
But one of us is maybe a little bit more adept at it for a number of reasons or whatever.
That's the difference between 8 and 10 to me. It's not that you can't do it.
It's not that you should not. Yeah.
No, it's just that, you know what? I'd rather you do it.
It's just you're better at this. I could potentially accomplish this. There are literal miraculous feats of strength in real life all the time. Oh, yeah. People literally lifting cars, like lifting other people like back
out of things.
Yeah, out of things, like lifting them up. People are heavy. They're hundreds of pounds. Like, you know, like
I've had that happen to me in enough concerts and stuff where someone pulls me out of a mosh pit that's forming because I look terrified.
Yeah,
and it's this dude who
lifted you up.
I had a guy, he was maybe 3 inches taller than me, literally by my coat.
Yeah,
moved me.
Just lift it. I mean,
I was like, dude, you don't even
again,
look.
Yeah, and again, dude, like. So that being the case, there are all kinds of people like, I don't feel like it should be just like, oh, if you don't have like, bonkers strength. Like I feel like a lot of people think like, oh, yeah, if you don't have like pluses, then you're literally weak. And you're atrophied. It's like no.
Weak is like 4.
Yeah, real weak would be like a 4, which is like a -3. Like that that would
that's
be
weak.
legitimately like you're weak. Like your body is now
Because what is
like,
the if
because
you
like
have like
wish the spell wish, if you use it, I think it drops your strength score to like a 4 or a 3, which is literally -3 or -4 to strength checks. And so like that is weak. And I feel like that right there with the use of the wish spell, which I believe we talked about in a previous episode, you should go check it out because it's great. We literally described it where it's like you are then weakened from that exertion of that spell.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a perfect example. It's like, it drops your strength to like 3 or 4, which means, you are now weak. That is what weak is. And I've played in a number of games where it's just like, it's like I usually like to play more Dex / magic-based characters usually. And my strength is usually my dump stat, which is mostly just an 8 at the lowest. Because I roll okay at stats usually, or I just use point buy. But it's like, they're like, oh, I have an 8 in strength. Oh, you're not lifted. Like, he's like, oh, there's a stone, there's a little stone chest here. And I'm like, okay, well, I like to lift it to like check for traps or whatever. He's like, oh, well, you're not lifting that with an 8 strength, dude. And I'm like, I can't even roll for. What do you mean? I have a -1. That's it. What are you talking about?
This goes back to, unfortunately, something we talked about in our last MetaTalks with the background stuff is that you should be able to try. You may not be the best at it, but you should be able to try.
Try, because you can, like, that's the point of the game. That's the point of rolling dice at all.
That's why we have 6 ability scores with stats associated with them. Is like, you might not be the best at something, but if I'm not proficient in deception, but I have a good charisma, I have the ability to lie better than someone with 0. You know what I mean? Like,
try, maybe, and to be fair, maybe we shouldn't say that you should always be able to try. You know what I mean? Yeah, you know what? There are some things that in the grand scope of things, like, again, it's like, it comes back to the whole example of like, oh, you're fighting the big bad evil guy who has done all this stuff, whose plans are just about to come to fruition. It is almost going to be impossible, if not impossible, for you to basically be like, hey, let's just be friends now and forget the whole thing ever happened, right? Like that's like, it's like, well, can I try to persuade him? And it's like, look, I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that you want to maybe like do some diplomacy and you want to role play. I love that. But I got to be honest, like, there is no real way that I could possibly think, regardless of what you roll, that would ever make him just change. Like, you're not controlling his mind. You can't change who he is and what he believes and what he's wanting to accomplish just with a natural 20. And even with, as a bard, you have a ridiculously high persuasion. It's like,
let's touch on this real quick, just because it's going to be pervasive throughout all of these. Technically, there's no critting for ability or skill checks.
There's no instant success or instant failure for a nat 1 or nat 20 on anything except attack rolls.
And that's even optional. The reality is that if you have a strength score of 8 or 10 or 12, and you roll a natural 20 strength check to try to push over a giant,
or a save, even a save.
Yeah, like a giant. I want to push a giant over. No. Sorry, like, they may falter slightly. I don't care how high you, like, if you roll a natural 20 and you have a +1, you roll a 21. That's a 21. You'd need a 25 or a 30.
Yeah, like again, sorry, it's not impossible. Again, if you have a character with a strength of 20, or like even a character with the same strength as said giant, because I think like hill giants have a strength of 21. It's
so,
like,
to me, if you have the same strength and you roll well, I'll let it. But if you have a 10 strength and you're like, I want to push that giant over.
If you have an 8 strength, no, you can't push a huge creature with
there's a reason why in the PHB and in the Dungeon Master's Guide that there is a task difficulty DC as an outline of like, hey, do you think this is going to be nearly impossible? Then you have to roll a 30. And you don't have to go off that specifically. But when a player at your table asks, I want to do this, and you look at their abilities and you're like, I'll let you try. But depending on how proficient they are with those things, you might raise or lower the DC. And I know that sounds weird and it sounds a little bit gamey and maybe it's a little bit mean. Someone might look at like, but he did it. Well, he has a 17 strength and you have a 10.
I mean, again, this is what he's good at. And you're not. At this. He's invested into this, and so obviously, the task might be either slightly easier, or if the task is just harder, but he's still capable of getting to that point anyway, you know? But you know what? For now, we've gone off on quite a bit of a tangent already.
I know.
Let's go ahead and continue on down the list, because we've still got 4 other attributes that we have not touched upon just yet.
To be fair, some of that had to be said before.
It did. I agree. No, again, that's why I specifically was like, you know what? Let's take a second to go off on this tangent, because there are a lot of things that maybe we should preface first as we continue, because as we talk more about these, you guys who might not be as familiar might begin to kind of understand like certain aspects of this game where it kind of comes into the attributes, and how a lot of them also can kind of correspond or cross over with one another and can be interchangeable depending. But yeah, for our third attribute, and that is going to be, again, one of the best. It's once more, no matter, and this one truly is, no matter what class or whatever you're playing, is always going to be exceedingly important and helpful and beneficial, and that is going to be Constitution. Your Constitution measures health, stamina, and vital force. And so just really quick right there, like what we said before, like with Sam saying, you know, your strength / athletics is a cool attribute or skill to use when you want to, like, you know, run for long distances. Constitution could also potentially be arguably a fair way to do that as well, because it specifically says it has to deal with your stamina. But Constitution checks are uncommon, and no skills apply to Constitution checks. That is true. There are no skills that specifically have Constitution as their foundation, because the endurance this ability represents is largely passive rather than involving a specific effort or on the part of a character or monster. A Constitution check can model your attempt to push beyond normal limits, however. So that right there is like a great application and kind of like example, right? Where it's like Constitution, if you wanted to, and once again, these don't come up super often in a lot of games, like you don't have to have a character or a creature make like a specific skill check for something, right? Like I think it's cool. I think it's absolutely good and cool, and I would 100% like advise or even suggest DMs to like do their best to try to make certain skills apply to situations, because that gives your players or your monsters potentially higher chances to succeed and do cool stuff. However, if, you know, there's a certain situation or circumstance that you feel none of the current skills could really be applicable to, you can just go ahead and say like, all right, you know what, I'm just going to choose whichever attribute maybe makes the most sense here for whatever, and you're going to roll that check. You're just going to roll a check just on your pure attribute score. Modifier, pardon me. And Constitution checks are obviously the case as well. Some Constitution checks could be such as holding your breath for longer periods of time, like underwater, whether you're like marching or laboring for hours on end without rest, whether or not, you know, you're gonna go without sleep and you'll start accruing exhaustion points if you don't get the chance to sleep and rest in a healthy, you know, manner. Whether you survive without food or water, or, you know, you quaff an entire stein of ale in one go. That's a literal quote right here, which is like, yeah,
that's a weird one for me, because I can go without sleep, but man, I do not function. But I can drink an entire beer in one go, so I don't know where my Constitution lies.
I mean, you know,
but here we are.
Like I said, it might, you know, whether you're like sleeping, if it's about like functioning without sleeping, you know, you could also maybe you could interchange that with like an intelligence check or a wisdom check for certain activities that you're trying to do while running on no sleep. You know what I mean?
I'm making a joke.
So it's honestly, and obviously we haven't even discussed the biggest reason why Constitution is one of the best stats. You're right, there's two, but probably the biggest is it is the direct effect on your health score, on your HP,
your vitality.
The higher your con, the more health or vitality you will have, and obviously the easier it is for you to survive any kind of encounter. Overall, there are also a pretty decent amount of Constitution saving throw effects in the game. There will be plenty of things that do like call for con saves, especially if you're also a spellcaster. Your Constitution saves are directly linked to what we would call your concentration checks / spells. We talked about that, I believe, in our spells episode, where certain spells require you to keep concentration on them. Basically, they are like reoccurring effects that will continue on for a certain period of time. You have to concentrate. However, they don't just simply last for that period of time. If you ever take damage or whatever else, you will then be needing to, or even if to say like there's like an environmental like
Hazard.
distraction or hazard, something that the GM might rule as being sufficient enough to like stymie your focus or concentration, he will then, or they will then ask you to make a concentration check, which I don't understand why they named it that, because it's misleading, because all it is a Constitution saving throw. So it's like it was dumb for them to say that, because it's actually a saving throw rather than it being a check, which is different. But that is specifically directly connected to your Constitution saving throw, which can be instrumental in any spellcaster.
Yeah. Which is why, playing as a sorcerer, that's the one upside sorcerers have, is a proficiency with Constitution saving throws.
Well, the issue is they don't have a lot of concentration spells, really. Like they have a few, but it doesn't matter because they don't really
Adam,
have...
you were not supposed to point out that second part. I don't know why.
How do you expect me to possibly resist that? How do you expect me to resist that? We've already decided on this particular channel we shit on sort. They are the resident.
No,
shit.
So when we do this and evident, like eventually, I will be on the side of positive source. I will be devil's advocate the whole time.
I guess we gotta do it. Everybody.
I'm good at debating, Adam. All I know is
sorcerers deserve love, Sam. Like you are a good debater, but I'm also a good debater. In fact, some might even say we're master debaters.
No, goddamn.
Some might even say
do it, and
we're
then
master debaters.
No.
Regardless, a debater can only truly be as good as what they are trying to debate, as the subject they're trying to debate. And unfortunately, you don't have much high ground for sorcerers, my friend. I'm sorry.
Okay, fine.
And I know you know it, but I appreciate you trying to rise to the challenge, and I respect it. But moving on.
Do we want to touch on how it affects your health? Because I can do that real quick.
Yeah, by all means, bud. We can let them know a little bit more.
When you're creating a character, you look at Constitution and you're like, oh, I don't know how many points to put into this. Think of it this way: every level you roll a hit die. Every level you gain in a class, you roll a hit die. The number added to that hit die, which is then added to your vitality or your health points, is based on your Constitution modifier, which makes it one of those skills that, if you can get it in an even 14 or a 16 is huge, and that is good for the rest of a game, realistically. Unless you're playing a frontline class or you cast a lot of spells, your con can be in that middle range at like a 14 or a 16, and you'll still be just fine. But if you can get it to like a 20 and you're playing a cleric that wears heavy armor or a fighter or barbarian, you'll be a sponge. And it's good. Which is cool is if you later on in your character level your Constitution up and get another point in your modifier, that retroactively affects your hit points for every level.
It does.
So there can be a point, say you're at like level 13 or 14 and you have a way to get your Constitution up by 1 point, say you have an ability score increase or whatever, your health will dramatically increase.
It will, because it applies to every level, like a dice roll that you had previously. So it
goes up by 1.
Yeah, any modifier, like the modifier for it. So as Sam said, every time you level up, you roll whatever like dice your specific class uses for their health. It could be a D6, a D8, a D10, or a D12 if you're a barbarian. And then you apply your Constitution modifier, which is like the smaller number based off of how high your overall number is, and that adds to whatever the roll you made for the dice. So if you have a D8, you roll an 8 max. If you have a 16 in con, you have a +3 to your con, which now makes that 8 into an 11. So you just got an extra 11 hit points.
Yeah, and it goes back. So if you're level 7 and you now add 1 to your Constitution, you get 7 extra hit points.
Yeah,
and it's helpful. People don't realize later on you'll take some ridiculous damage.
That's what, again, like con is one next to Dexterity. Like it will help every single class, and there was never it is never a bad or wrong thing to add your an attribute like increase to your con. It will always help you, no matter what you're doing, who you are, what your character is. Always will.
Survivability is great. We will
It's
move into our fourth ability, which is intelligence.
Oh yes, this is now going to be similar in certain ways to like strength. It's the other side of the coin. A lot of people kind of feel.
Kind of. Your intelligence measures mental acuity, accuracy of recall, and the ability to reason. Intelligence checks come into play when you need to draw on logic, education, memory, or deductive reasoning. Skills affected by this are Arcana, History, Investigation, Nature, and Religion. Those skills reflect your aptitude in certain kinds of intelligence. Now, here's the thing with intelligence. I almost never build characters that use it unless it's for a very specific type of character or they're a wizard. Now, it does affect a wide array of skills. So things like Arcana, History, Investigation, Nature, and Religion. All of these are good skill checks if you're trying to figure something out or find something. It's the difference between being like a studied researcher and an investigator. They're both intelligence, just very different kinds. But all of these skills are useful.
I mean, all of them are like they are, and in fact, in my opinion, I feel like they could be applied to a great. They might be
a great number of things.
They might be like among all of the attributes. All of the skills associated with intelligence are probably the most applicable in almost any situation. Like every other attribute, certain skills will be like way more applicable, while others will be almost non-existent in almost any, like, unless it's very specific circumstances or situations, there's like none. But with intelligence, all of its skills, I can pretty confidently say you can apply in almost any situation or area you're in. Again, you have Arcana, which literally can just measures your ability to recall lore about spells, magic items, eldritch symbols, magical traditions, the planes of existence, and the inhabitants of those planes. Like basically anything not magical. You can just remember stuff or maybe like logically deduce certain things from this skill. After that, you have History, which again, in my opinion, I feel like, it once again can also apply to just about almost any circumstance, situation, or item, person. You see a person, you be like, can I roll a history check to see if I might recognize this individual, if they might maybe, made kind of a splash in an area or something, if they have some sort of historical value, like anything really. Investigation is going to be very interchangeable with the other, like, look around, figure stuff out skill, which is Perception. A lot of people, feel like investigation and perception are basically the same thing, but just like investigation is the intelligence version and perception is the wisdom version.
I have a thought about that.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. Another one, which a lot of people feel like doesn't make a lot of sense, is Nature, which is intelligence, which I also agree. I
do and I don't.
Let's put a stop just a second again to go into, like, for instance, for this kind of thing. I think this particular skill brings up a maybe not hot topic in the community, but in my opinion, an important one, important discussion, which is like Nature essentially it checks the measure your ability to recall lore about terrain, plants, animals, the weather, and natural cycles. Now, that's great. That's awesome. However, I feel like intelligence, while I think it could be applicable to that, you could use your intelligence, I also don't see any reason why you couldn't possibly utilize your wisdom for Nature. If, say, again, you are a druid or a ranger who are intrinsically tied, or a barbarian even, who are either intrinsically tied or even just vastly experienced with this type of topic. You're going through terrain, plants, animals, weather, natural cycles. Like, that is what you have experienced. And so it's like, I don't think it should necessarily just be based off of your intelligence alone, but maybe even your wisdom, which is more usually corresponds with your experience of life and your natural,
I think that kind of leads into what people use nature for. Because rules is written. Nature is the lore of certain things. Nature is understanding what certain things do. Now, you can make a play that, oh, it should be wisdom based. I would argue that if you want to do things like harvest things or know about what something does, your DM can call for a survival roll instead.
Yeah,
To me, nature,
those are
like,
kind of interchangeable.
to me, the reason that nature is an intelligence skill, and I actually am fine with the way it works, is that it's like someone who's a botanist is going to
It's
know
technical, is what you're saying.
it's a technical understanding, whereas someone who lives off the land has almost an innate kind of like, oh, I know what this is, I'm
Well,
just going to use it. It may not know every particular aspect of it, but he knows how to grow it or where to find it, whereas nature to me is more of a technical, you might know what this is because you've read about it or studied about it. And so for me, that's more of a DM issue in terms of calling for the right check. I think
I agree.
nature checks can easily be substituted out for survival checks if it's about those very specific things, as opposed to nature, which is a technical thing.
Maybe, and this might just become more of like a debate about, or talk, a discussion about, like, just basically, each skill can be interchangeable, or certain skills can be interchangeable, but you might just learn different things about whatever subject you're using each individual skill for. So in regards to, let's say, nature, survival, or investigation / perception, it's like, depending on which one you use, or even arcana / history, depending on which one you use, which technically arcana and history are both intelligence, but you might still just learn different types of things in certain ways about them. Like that, I think that is a perfectly reasonable, fair way to go.
Yeah,
Personally, like,
yeah.
I also just feel like it's like, I don't see why you can't just use your wisdom. If you're proficient in nature, I don't see why, like, because I feel like it also has the added the thing about, people are like, well, I don't have a high intelligence, even though I'm like a druid or a ranger or a barbarian, and I would probably know about nature. I don't have a high intelligence because that's my dump stat or whatever. So I'm not gonna take this skill as a proficiency. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
see, I'm the opposite.
Even though
I
you
would
can't.
take it
Well,
anyway.
that's what I'm saying. I think a lot of people might be like kind of warded off by that, because they're like, well, my highest attribute, like, I can't use, this is my dump stat here, most likely, so I'm not going to be, why would I take a skill to be proficient in to then not really be that good in it in? Whereas,
I
like,
mean,
that's why I would be like, I'm like, all right, you know what, if this is something that you like for your character, like, you feel, your character is very natural, they know about nature, they have a green thumb or whatever, take that proficiency for that skill, and you can just use your wisdom for it instead of intelligence. Because again, I feel like, again, even a person who, like, I think they could know more specific kind of information and stuff about nature and stuff like that. In regards to survival, which we will get to in a second, we can kind of do a more maybe accurate comparison between the two when we get to it. But for the final skill in regards to intelligence, it would be your religion, which once again can also, like, it's a check that measures your ability to recall lore about deities, rites and prayers, religious hierarchies, holy symbols, and the practices of secret cults. So as you would notice, there is a reoccurring theme in all of intelligence skills, is it
lore.
It specifically states it's about your capacity and ability to recall information and lore about specific subjects, which is fair. Intelligence, I absolutely do feel like is absolutely that. A person's intelligence doesn't necessarily mean that they're, like, smarter than anyone else per se, even in real life, right? Your intelligence isn't necessarily like, oh, you're smarter, but it more so has to kind of do with your capacity to retain information about stuff, right? Because I would also say, a person who is exceedingly wise, once again, is also could be considered smarter than a person who's maybe even intelligent in certain ways, right?
Yeah, or vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa. And certain, it's about, intelligence is your capacity to recall certain information and lore. I would even say wisdom might even be your capacity to maybe learn and apply things, actively, in a sense.
It's definitely, like, I think there is a bit of a a back and forth between intelligence versus wisdom, and I think we'll continue that once we go over the wisdom skills.
Yeah.
To me, intelligence, it is a measure of your intellect in the most basic sense.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that if you don't have a high intelligence, your character
You're
can't
an
be
idiot. Yeah.
reasonably smart, because you know what, there's more than just book smart. And
I will-
I think intelligence is a book smart, if you think of it
That's
in
what
the
I'm
most
saying.
basic sense.
It's about,
Wisdom is more, outer world, like worldly smart, in terms of
I would
like
say just again, you're reasonable.
yeah,
You can
but I would
understand common
also,
sense, or you can deduce things. Intelligence can also do that as well.
yeah, and I would argue things like certain skills in charisma and
Sure, I would
wisdom are
agree.
also technically, you have to be mentally acute, like you have to be
Yeah,
there.
you have to be
You
mentally
can't have
adept to a
dead
certain
brain,
extent. Yeah,
doesn't work.
a person who's got great charisma probably is particularly linguistically prominent and
Yeah,
proficient. Like you can
yeah.
speak, so you would obviously need to require a decent amount of intelligence, or
You're at least well spoken enough.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like again, you are able and you don't have to be. There are plenty of things that are super adorable and charismatic that speak very like in lilts, or whatever. But it's like again, all of this stuff to say, as we kind of said before, just because a score might not be high doesn't necessarily mean that you have to play that character in like a specific type of way. You can, it's like I even respect a person who's like, hey, I have an intelligence of like 6 or whatever, that is low. Like I would say that's on the lower side. So it's like, yeah, I might not necessarily be able to understand or to like see through certain or not lies, I should say, because that's actually technically a wisdom skill. But I'm not necessarily able to like deduce certain, puzzles, or
Or
understand
logistical
more.
facts.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
understand maybe more complex, algorithms and other kind of things, or concepts maybe. And that's fine, but it also shouldn't mean that it's like, oh, I can't understand that this is a trap, or that these people are bad, or that I should attack this. Like don't try to make him out to be like he's like a literal like dumb ass. You know what I mean? Like he
Well,
doesn't.
it's the argument of my intelligence might be high, but my battle acumen is.
Yeah,
Soldiers
you
are not
exactly in
known.
combat.
Like you look at, like, especially in fantasy tropes, soldiers not known for their wealth of intelligence, but
Not necessarily.
battle tactics is a
Well,
thing. Grid fighting and things like that are not necessarily tied to your book smarts. Now, grand strategy maybe, but being able to
maybe seeing
function
a
in a
whole picture.
being able to function in a team of 6, just because your intelligence is an 8 or a 6, does not mean you constantly make dumb moves of positioning. And that's something that pisses me off when I play with some people that don't play strategy, like don't use strategy. I understand that not everybody's going to, but when I played my first D&D character, it was a barbarian. Intelligence was my dump stat, and my DM thought it was weird that my character was always in the best positioning. And I was like, first of all, my main thing that I do is fighting, and I am instinctually good at this. So I will use that. I will use my wisdom, which is above average, as an excuse for me
This
knowing what I'm doing.
this is what I was gonna say. Like this again kind of leads back into what I was saying before about interchanging your attributes for specific kind of stuff. Which one again? It's like, and if you are just good at something, if you are experienced, like you do this thing, like it's regardless of whatever stat, like the fact that your intelligence is low, you are in combat. You are about survival. You have lived this long because you are good at this thing. So just because your intelligence is low doesn't mean that you are not talented and intelligent in this way to make yourself very adept and proficient. Like, yeah, switch I mean, hell, I would even say you could utilize your dex or strength as a means of saying you're good in combat, or you understand how things work in combat, because your strength is like, okay, I know where to be to like fully utilize my strength to its best extent to have maximum effect on my attacks and my strikes. I dexterous. I'm so dex. I know like specifically where to be, what positioning I should be in to hit as I should to get the maximum benefit for my attacks.
Ostensibly, it's essentially the difference between like battle acumen, which would be the physical stats, intuition, which is wisdom, and tactics, which is intelligence. There's a reason why we have this separation between the 3 physical stats, the 3 mental stats.
Yeah.
There's a way to twist any of them at least for the mental stats, in my opinion, to what you're trying to do. Again, as you said before, it's just the information you get out of it. Um, we'll go into wisdom now because I have a point to make about our nature
Uh,
survival point.
Before we head over to wisdom, I do want to just say one last thing about specifically intelligence. Whereas there are a number of, as we said, kind of with Constitution, there are a number of like ways you can apply intelligence that might not necessarily be in regards to the skills. They have a number of like actually great examples right here. With your intelligence checks, if just a straight kind of intelligence check, it's like this could be used to communicate with a creature without using words, for example. I think that's, I wanted to at least touch on now because I think that's a big one. I know in a lot of games, there are like people that are like, oh, do you understand what this creature is saying? Do you share a language? Well, then you can't communicate at all. And it's like, well, okay. I feel like that in essence is like, I don't, that first off, that creates like a huge kind of like hurdle and obstacle now of just like a literal language barrier to try and get things done, especially if this is like an NPC or a creature that is like important to the story that we need to communicate with. It's like, you should still, if you are both relatively intelligent creatures, and hell, even if maybe you're intelligent and it might be average to below average, you should still have some kind of way to attempt to communicate accurately. There are ways to communicate non-verbally or like succinctly through language. Like there are plenty of ways to communicate.
Charades and Pictionary come to mind.
Literally, like, and you're able to, there are plenty of ways to convey that very clearly to a person, because we as a species, as creatures, especially in D&D, it's like we all do have a number of concepts and understandings that just cross any kind of culture, language barrier, or whatever, that we can just understand. Like literally nodding, right? Any human is like this, whatever, is just a universal, like this and this are just universal things of like, yes, no, like we just know that for whatever reason. And I feel like this is a means of being like, yeah, if you roll a decent high intelligence check, you should be able to kind of convey your meaning to whatever creature that has, again, at least a reasonable amount of capacity to understand. Another one is estimate the value of a precious item. That's, I think, also a lot of the times it's not really applied too much, that maybe it should more often than not. Although, to be fair, plenty of DMs will just be like, hey, you just have this gem now and you know that it's 500 gold because,
Yeah, if someone in your party has above average intelligence, you can just know that. You don't necessarily need to make a roll.
There's another one, pull together a disguise to pass as a city guard. I think that works. I think there's plenty of other attributes that could also be used for that same kind of activity. There's forge a document, which, that's where you literally do have forgery tools. And I guess you could utilize like your intelligence and then proficiency with forgery tools to then like get a bonus with that. Recall lore, obviously, or apparently win a game of skill. So there are plenty of ways that you can apply your intelligence to any number of situations, circumstances, aside from just simply, as most of its skills do, is recall information about things. So this is more of an active application, which I
use that information now.
Yes. But moving on, as Sam said, to our fifth and arguably, one of the best attributes in the game, or it certainly is, it is the foundational attribute of the most used skill in the entire game, and that is wisdom. Wisdom reflects how attuned you are to the world around you and represents perceptiveness and intuition. Now, those particular words, perceptiveness and intuition, like I feel like a lot of people, as we're going to get into, I feel like a lot of people maybe they limit exactly what those things encompass. Wisdom check. So wisdom check might reflect an effort to read body language, understand someone's feelings, notice things about the environment, or care for an injured person. The animal handling, insight, medicine, perception, and survival skills reflect aptitude in certain kinds of wisdom checks. Animal handling. When there is any question whether you can calm down a domesticated animal, keep a mount from getting spooked, or intuit an animal's intentions, the DM might call for a wisdom animal handling check. You also make wisdom animal handling checks to control your mount when you attempt a risky maneuver. Insight, which again, one of the absolute most used skills in the entire game. Your insight check decides whether you can determine the true intentions of a creature, such as when searching out a lie or predicting someone's next move. Doing so involves gleaning clues from body language, speech habits, and changes in mannerisms. That is a phenomenal skill. And
Yeah.
once again, I would also like to put forth, I could reasonably see you interchanging wisdom for intelligence to do insight checks. Because it's also, again, it's like, as an intelligence person, it's like you are able to recall like information about this person, to notice any abnormalities and how they're behaving and functioning, or to even recall if they have certain tells. You know what I mean? Like that would just make sense to me based off of a lot of the things intelligence is used for in their own examples. Medicine, a wisdom medicine check lets you try to stabilize a dying companion or diagnose an illness. Once again, this shows I don't see why you couldn't use intelligence for this too. Again, lore about medicine. It also is the same thing of like why it also doesn't make sense why you can't interchange it with nature. Medicine, nature, survival, like these three skills are so intrinsically connected in many ways to one another that it's like it makes no sense why you couldn't technically apply your dominant stat that you kind of primarily utilize to these skills. Perception, which is just honestly almost not like, can't even really debate it. It is the most used skill in the entire game. Your perception checks lets you spot, hear, or otherwise detect the presence of something. It measures your general awareness of your surroundings and the keenness of your senses. For example, you might try to hear a conversation through a closed door, eavesdrop under an open window, or hear monsters moving stealthily in the forest. Or you might try to spot things that are obscured or easy to miss, whether they are orcs lying in ambush on a road, thugs hiding in the shadows of an alley, or candlelight under a closed secret door. Now, again, as you may have noticed, perception sounds exceedingly similar to investigation. When investigation is when you look around for clues and make deductions based on those clues, you make an intelligence investigation check. You might deduce the location of a hidden object, discern from the appearance of a wound what kind of weapon dealt it, or determine the weakest point in a tunnel that could cause it to collapse. Poring through ancient scrolls in search of a hidden fragment of knowledge might also call for an investigation check. See, those two things, obviously, to do investigation, you're probably going to have to use your perception, right? You're going to have to use your senses. You're going to have to look for things. You're going to have to see things, hear things, all of that stuff. And a lot of people kind of say, you know, if anything, if something recalls for a perception check, then there maybe shouldn't be any reason why you couldn't use an investigation check instead, if that's what you're good at.
I do have I do have kind of a counterpoint, and not to argue with you.
No, please do. I would love to hear other stances on it.
This is kind of the reason why I don't have a problem with how things work as written, and the fact, like, personally in my games, I wouldn't have you use your it would just be you, if you want to do this check and I say it's investigation, there is no using your wisdom for it. And the only reason I say that is I feel like one of these things is like an innate understanding in terms of like wisdom. It's you kind of know how things go on around you. You're good at noticing things or noticing people. Whereas you may be able to find it with that, and then intelligence is the specific application. It goes vice versa. Nature is understanding how this thing is going to work. Survival is the application of it. For me, perception is noticing things, and investigation is getting deep down a closer look at something.
Yeah, I have also heard that thing.
So that's kind of how we've always used it, and honestly, we've never really ran into, I think, an issue of where someone was like, "Oh, I should be good at that," and now I'm not. It's like, no. It's more like it depends on what you're looking for. If you're in the middle of a woods and you think someone's following you, that's going to be perception. Investigation is not going to apply. If you're in a ruin and you're trying to figure out if there's a hidden compartment somewhere, you might be able to say perception can notice something, but actually being able to find the trigger mechanism is going to be investigation. To me, that there's this little spot where they intersect and then they both branch out to do something different. Which to me, if you're giving your characters at the table an opportunity to use all of those skills, you're going to end up with the information you need anyway. Unless your entire table rolls wisdom-based characters and not one person is good at intelligence, then maybe you should talk to your table. But I think there's also the talk of like, do I take a proficiency in a skill even if it's not on my best stat? Yes, you should.
You should.
I hate when people are like, oh, well, I don't use Dex, so I'm not going to take acrobatics, or I don't use wisdom, so I'm not going to take insight. But you can be insightful without being super wise, because that's something you've had to do, whether you're good at it or not.
It's true.
You've gained
And
proficiency and you got better.
you
That's what that
will
whole function is.
Yeah, you will at the very least, because if you're proficient in something, you get your just baseline proficiency bonus that just increases as you level up. Like certain levels, like you're just gonna get better at that. You're not necessarily ever gonna be the best at it, especially compared to somebody else who does have a higher foundational stat in that skill than you, maybe. But like you will always be pretty good at that if it is something that, like, for instance, your character does a lot. If you are, like Sam said, if you are an insightful character, you like to incite people and try to figure out what they're feeling, maybe what they're thinking, what they're intending, what might be going on, then yeah, absolutely. Take that skill, even if you might not have a high attribute in it.
Yeah.
But again, what I will say again to that is like I said, my only thing of why I would say they're interchangeable is, once again, because if you're investigating something, I don't understand. Like, there is no way that you wouldn't technically be using literally your perception to do that.
Yeah, their wording is unfortunate.
Like their investigation requires literally your senses and perceptions to do this thing. Vice versa, it's like I would maybe agree that, like, for instance, investigation wouldn't necessarily work for, like, if you're hearing or listening, like you notice something like following you, right? You're not actively investigating at that point, sure. However, I could then technically make the argument, maybe, though, that it's like, oh, you are hearing something in the background, and maybe like your wisdom isn't super high per se, but your intelligence is, that you begin to notice, again, just based off your recollection, abnormalities in the current environment and what's happening, because you recall what something was previously, and you are noticing, based off of logical deduction, as they even said was intelligence use, something is off. This is your logical, rational deduction, utilizing information that you just have and you can recall, to be like, hey, something is wrong here. I mean, perception is also the same thing on, like, using your wisdom. It's like, you notice wisdom, yes, can be an intrinsic, almost instinctual thing, like when an animal's like hackles raise, their hair kind of like stands on end, or if you feel like you're being watched or something like that. But, like, intelligence could also be applied to logically deduce in a situation something is off, something is wrong, or I can notice, again, the abnormalities in that thing by being like, the tiles, like, say for instance, somebody is like, using that old like the ninja, like, camouflage, you're like holding up like a tarp or something that like blends in. It's like, you could be like, oh, I use my intelligence to logically deduce the shaping and patterns on there are slightly off. I think not measure up.
The real difference, and this is kind of how I look at it, is one of them is an instinctual thing, and one is a learned thing, being intelligence. And the reality is not necessarily that they both can't eventually do the same thing. It's time frame.
I still feel like
perception is an immediate thing. If I go into a room, perception, I am there, I'm looking. Investigation is something that takes time. So while both perception and investigation, with your example, could find the person with the thing held up, with perception, if you're really good, you might notice something off immediately. Investigation is going to take time. And so
I agree. Yeah.
That's kind of the way we've always done it at the table, is like, if you're good at both, you're good at both. But odds are, depending on what you're looking for and how it's taken. So when you walk into a room and you're like, is there anything off? That's perception. If I'm going to spend 10-20 minutes in a room looking over the walls and looking at a door frame and trying to see if there's a hidden compartment in this drawer, that's investigation. Because perception is surface level. Investigation, you're getting under the surface, is kind of how we've always ran it. And I think it works.
I 100% agree to that. Again, I would say, like, there are obviously certain ways that they can, but I do agree that the skills themselves do have spots where they can branch off. Like, I'm not saying they're completely interchangeable. My argument is more so intelligence / wisdom being applied to both of those.
I guess.
Because technically, again, by the whole point of perception and wisdom being applied to perception, you can also apply that to investigation. Investigation is different in that you can get more, like, specific, maybe like in-depth information about something. But whereas with perception, but I still think, again, both your intelligence, which I feel like it's not necessarily a learned thing, like, it is still innate. It's just the way you apply any information that you are gathering and processing slightly different. You know, you're getting the same information. The way you're just applying it to understanding a situation, whether it be intelligence or wisdom, is different. Yeah. Again, like I said, intelligence is like you're able to deduce, like, okay, based off of the information and knowledge that you had gained previously, there's something wrong. Wisdom is like, you might not necessarily even be more specifically aware of something, but you're just like, something is wrong here. There's a literal disturbance in the force that you are sensing naturally.
It's a hard one because
it is, and
the way that it runs at a table, like, to me personally, your argument of some of these things might be interchangeable is a fine argument. If I was DMing something for you and you came to me and you're like, I don't like how this works, I want to be able to use my other skill to do this, I may let you do it, but you're going to have to go about it a different way. And you may like that, you may not like that. But I think the way they have it written down is a pretty good, backing for how each of the skills work. And I don't want to take away, like, so you're like, oh, I don't want to put in, I want to use my wisdom for nature. It's like, well, then what's the point of being a well-studied individual? Like, to me, that's where you take away from someone else who maybe has high intelligence and took nature. So yes, there's an exchange. I think the baseline is both nature and survival can get you information about the same thing, but it's just different information is the best possible, like, go-between.
No, I agree. I think, again,
I think that's the best way.
I think with the skills giving you different information, I think that's great. I absolutely go for that, and I think that is the best way to apply skills. Once again, my argument is more so about interchanging the base attribute foundations to utilize in those skills. So like I said earlier, I feel like, again, it would give people a lot more freedom, and in fact, not limit people and take away from what certain characters want to do. Like, if a person wants to make a specific character, they want to make a druid, but a druid can be very technical and be maybe a little bit nerdier and book smart in a way, and be able to notice certain things and be in nature. It doesn't seem like it makes any sense for them not to be able to do that, just because, again, the foundation, because again, druids don't really need intelligence. Like, it might not be their dump stat, like, because strength probably would be. It shouldn't be. But also, they're not, but I also don't see why they couldn't apply their wisdom to it if it's, again, about things where they clearly should have pretty decent information about it, And it's like, because this is obviously going to be what they're best at, if they want to make a character who they do want to have now, like, say, for instance, even the player themselves is very knowledgeable about plants, animals, creatures, and it's like, hey, yeah, your character probably would be too. If this is what you want to do, you can use your wisdom for that instead of having to, like, potentially be less
I would almost say, like,
less optimal if you want to do that as well.
I would almost say, if you don't like the skill being investigation or intelligence, then have it make a general wisdom check and make the DC different. If you yourself as a DM look at a character and you're like, yeah, you should know,
sure,
then I would change the check they're making. It's easier than switching everything around, in my opinion. But I understand what you're saying.
All you would do is you would just simply add your wisdom modifier instead of your intelligence modifier. That would be it. You would, if you're proficient, you just basically be like, what's my proficiency bonus? Okay, it's a 3. What's my wisdom? It's also a 3. All right, you get a +6 to this check. Like that.
That's fine. Yeah, you just do that. You say, well, you have a wisdom check with proficiency. Just make that instead.
That's what I would say is just how it would work. This, and again, because you're using this skill, you're going to get specific information by using this specific skill as opposed to the other skill.
Yeah.
Like, that's the point I'm making, where it's like, this character, I feel like, again, if you want them to be able to be good at this, to get this type of information, that's fine. Especially, again, if just logically or realistically, and I don't want to use the term realistically because that's not necessarily the right one, but just, reasonably, then yeah, you should be able to use this foundational skill that you're good at to get this information.
But yeah, I like that we differ, but we still want the same thing.
Yeah, again, like I said, again, it's about, it's simply, I guess, about how you like to apply it to the game. But the final skill that we talked about a little bit, but didn't actually get into depth.
My favorite one
is survival. The DM might ask you to make a wisdom survival check to follow tracks, hunt wild game, guide your group through frozen wastelands, identify signs that owl bears live nearby, predict the weather, or avoid quicksand and other natural hazards. This is also a great one if you especially early on if you're going to be trekking through any kind of habitat, territory, or wherever.
Yeah, to me, and I'm going to put this as succinctly as possible. Survival is finding all the herbs and knowing if they're safe to eat, and nature would be I know how to make them into a salve or a potion. That would be to me the main differential. They're both in the same vein. This one's the actual trekking around and finding it. The other one is maybe knowing how to use it after the fact. But I love survival. I take it on almost every outside character, unless I'm making a strictly urban character. I take it on everybody. I love survival.
Survival is great. I mean, again, I feel like it is, however, obviously very circumstantial. Like, for instance, if your campaign is being run primarily like in a city, it could still be applicable, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah,
like,
100%.
Like getting through the city and stuff. But there are plenty of DMs that are like, no, survival is just for, outside in the wild, whatever.
No, survival can be used in urban environments. Yeah, go for it.
Well, like another thing I wanted to say is like for survival obviously can always also be used for, as it says, tracking. Mm-hmm. I also, however, feel that it could be utilized. I feel like investigation could be used to track shit. Like I don't see why.
Again, it's one is more like quick. I can just do it right now, and one takes more time. Is the only thing that for me.
I think that would make sense too. I think like if you're investigating like tracking, it might take more time than if you're survival tracking.
You're also a lot more noticeable. Would be the exchange for me. Is like you can investigate these tracks and figure out where they go. It's going to take more time, and someone is going to see you standing there, looking at something,
watching it with like a magnifying glass. Like,
I know it sounds dumb, but otherwise, you have to make these kinds of concessions because then any character that has 3 skills can do everything, and it takes away from other characters who might be better at those things just innately is fine. That's why there's team roles and there's party checks of well, I have someone who's good at investigation and I have someone who's good at survival. I want both of you to roll those checks because then you can work together. Yeah, and then everyone gets to be a part of it.
But we also want to have those moments for your players to be able to shine with their character. To be like, hey, I'm really good at this thing. Oh, perfect. I'm not as great as this thing as you would be. So yeah, hit it and like, that gives that character and that player a chance to be like, I rolled like a 26 on this check. Like that, that feels great.
It's awesome.
Like, and you helped contribute to the party and to the story and to progression. And everybody always loves that. That's great. Some other, I guess, like wisdom-based checks that, like, I guess wouldn't be applicable to some of the skills, which honestly, I've never really seen this. Usually you can apply most of the wisdom-based skills pretty, like, generously and diversely. But apparently for wisdom checks, the DM might also call for you to, like, roll just a flat wisdom check to, like, get a gut feeling about
to me, that's insight.
Action. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Insight, I feel like, still can do that. Or discern whether a seemingly dead or living creature is undead, which again, I feel like you could do that with intelligence too. Like that.
I mean, but I get it. It's kind of, I don't know.
Like again, it's not. I feel like usually you can also do that with either perception or insight to be like, are you undead? Or because like you can literally like notice, oh, you're not breathing at all. Oh, you smell rotting. Oh, you're limping in a strange kind of way, or you're dropping.
That's insight perception. If you'd rather just roll a flat wisdom check, that's up to your DM, and it makes sense either way.
I feel like again, usually most people are going to be proficient, and so it's like if you have a higher chance, obviously you're going to want to use insight or perception. And like my biggest thing is like I just feel like a lot of people as either players or DMs, because there's these certain like specific things that are either omitted or not added or deliberately said that it's like, oh, well, this is the only way that it happens. This is how it works. And a lot of the time I feel like DMs can use that as like a means of unnecessarily or unreasonably making the game harder or more like, clunky, where it's like, I want to make it so that you it's harder for you to do this thing just because I want to make it harder. Not necessarily because it's going to be more fun to make this particular thing harder. But it's just like I just want to do it because I want to make it harder for you.
Yeah,
I'm like that's never fun in my opinion.
It's a very arbitrary way of changing.
That's what I'm saying. It's like you're adding is like for me. It's like it's great to add obstacles for sure in any game for people like to be like, hey, this is what makes kind of finally getting and accomplishing or succeeding all the much more rewarding as if it was difficult. But if it's like we're literally just trying to like follow some tracks to get to the part that we want to get to, why are you making it so difficult for us to do that? You showed us the tracks. We noticed them there. So let us try it. Like, and it's like, oh, well, we don't have anybody who's like great with survival. You know what I mean? Maybe in the party, like nobody necessarily took survival as a proficiency, but somebody has investigation. Like, okay, can I use investigation instead? And like, no, survival is the only check you can use to like follow tracks.
Yeah, that's
like,
unfortunate because it's just not true.
It's like, just not true.
It
doesn't make sense. It's not.
Your methods are different, but your end result should be similar. And the reality is
trying to get there. Like,
you're the one who wants me to follow these tracks.
Yeah.
So
let me that there.
Let me, even if someone's not great at survival, if survival doesn't work and you have to use something else, like for me, any kind of obstacle should have different types of skill checks for different results.
And that's what I'm saying. You know, they or just different flavor. You know, the result might be inevitably the same, but the flavor and how you get there and how, you know, it unfolds, could be different.
Like, for example, you have like a hidden door, right? In a dungeon. I could, with my investigation, perception could find the hidden door. Investigation could find the switch that opens the door. Now, if I find the door but don't find the switch, there is nothing stopping a character from grabbing a pickaxe and using their strength score to break down the hidden door.
To pry it open or cut it open if they have a weapon that can, like, you know, just
there's technically another way to get through that door. Now, it is a very mundane way to get through that door, and it takes a lot longer. But it should be available.
I feel there are plenty of DMs that don't do that. Plenty of DMs are like, you can only accomplish this one way. You can only do it.
Put it in front of me.
You can only do it in the way, and that in essence lies my issue with not being able to interchange attributes with certain skills. Because it's like, again, if you have a shitty attribute that you're just like, okay, I can't, like, again, one of the biggest things is like, I feel like almost any time in my experience, and let me know what you feel about this, people taking the skill medicine, right? Medicine, like, I feel like only people who first kind of start out playing the game take medicine. And after that, you never really take medicine at all, mostly, because it's like medicine, even based off of just the check itself, is literally like, you do this to stabilize a creature or diagnose an illness, you know? And it's like, you usually don't stabilize people much anymore, because there's just so many other ways to heal them, which also gets them back up right away, rather than them just being unconscious. And it's like, but the thing is like, you know, with medicine, it's like, you would still be able to be like, and again, usually only like clerics or maybe druids take it too, because it is a wisdom-based thing. But it's also like, it also makes no sense where it's like, okay, what if you have like a wizard or maybe an artificer who wants to be a little bit more like healing and stuff, and can maybe apply that in that way? Like,
I mean, you can take medicine no matter what class you are, obviously. I think for me, if I'm taking medicine as a wizard, yes, I might not be as good at a cleric at applying these things, but I definitely know how it works. Is kind of how I like to spin stuff for myself when I make a character, because I could put medicine on my cleric and have a really good medicine score, or I can put medicine on my intelligence caster or charisma caster, and it's still decent. It's just not as good, but I can still just do the thing anyway. To me, I think the stickler is like, you have to have the highest number. You really don't.
Well, like I said,
is like, if you're playing in a game where having a +5 or 6 or 7 to a stat isn't enough, then your DM is doing difficulty checks wrong, because
that might be the case.
I think that's what it is, because unless this thing is it's so difficult that you shouldn't be able to do it, then having a decent score in any of these abilities is enough.
Well, here's another caveat I will add to that. It's not necessarily just that maybe your DM is making like checks unnecessarily high or difficult, but it also might be like, for instance, for me, I say this as well as somebody who I am a infamous, notoriously bad roller. Like in almost anything that I can have just some, like, even online, like I've been playing online recently, and even with some of the AI dice bot, you know, rollers, it's like I still roll pretty bad at times. Although I roll pretty good too. I feel like it's
more even.
Yeah, it's been balancing out recently in a lot of ways. But I notoriously low roll. Like the only way you can ever really get even something that like looks decent is with a pretty high like bonus to that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's why it's like, again, once more, for me, it's primarily about, I don't want to limit any player or character from being able to like do the things that they want to be good at, simply because the game doesn't specifically stipulate and say, oh, you can interchange your foundational attributes for whatever you're focusing on to be applicable to these things, even though technically they do. They all do pretty kind of cross and coincide or could be applied. Like, and not even that difficult. Like, it's not complicated or hard to do, you know.
No, I think there's, it's a weird one. I haven't really ran into that issue.
Another thing I will say too is that some DMs for certain things might not even let you make a check unless you are proficient with a skill. Like, that is another rule, which again, I don't mind necessarily.
I get like,
I understand that. I think I would run it that way as well, where it's like, hey, if this isn't like, you know, wide common knowledge, if this is maybe something maybe a little bit more obscure or something like, and for instance, like a history check, right? It's like, if certain people are going to be more learned or have more information about, you know, a vast number of things than others, you know, artificers, wizards, whatever. And if you have proficiency, then that also means that even if you don't have like a high intelligence, you still at least
you put some time into it,
learn, and to become a little bit more acquainted. So there's like, okay, people ask like, do I know this person? Like, okay, well, who has proficiency in history? This gives, again, those characters who specifically took that a moment to shine, given that ability. However, of course, it's like, once again, it's like, all right, well, if you're a druid who has proficiency in history and say it's like, you know, it's an ancient like forest spirit or deity in some way, in this case maybe it would be religion, either way, it's like, you know, it's like, you know what,
I'd argue both. You could do both, either one.
I would as well. And so I'd be like, all right, you know what, if you have proficiency, you can do it, and you can use your wisdom specifically because you would be intrinsically like attuned and know of information most likely about, or you could, based obviously on your role, and I would say even then you probably do, but just how high your role is might also determine how much information you would know or recall. And so
I can see that. I understand why that's
just how I feel, because there's just, in my experience, there's been a number of situations and moments where, and once again, it's like, where even just asking this question, like, oh, hey, could I maybe do this, or maybe could I apply it this way? If this is the only way that you're saying that this can really work, then can I find a way to like make it work? And then they're like, no, you can only do it this specific way to make it work. And that's just, I mean, you're like, all right, then why are we here? Like, why are we playing right now? Like,
I will say I might not fully agree with you on the whole switching what the attribute affects which skill, but I am in full support of I should be able to do something else here. It may not get me to the end goal the same way, but if you're only giving me one option, then we're doing something wrrong. Because railroading is wrong intrinsically, the way that,
depending on what you're doing, some railroading can be good,
fine, but I mean railroading a specific encounter to only go one way.
I think maybe a better word is road blocking.
That's what it is.
Road blocking is the problem. Railroading is okay, to a point where it's like, if you're trying to, again, especially if it's like, you know, like a one shot or whatever, it's like there needs to be
you have to railroad
some railroad to fucking get the shit done. But it's like, if you are railroading a party, if you want them to even follow a specific bread trail that you left,
you can't block off every path except
you can't just block the stuff off to get to the point, again, to either like increase time or to establish like some kind of obstacle, just to establish an obstacle. Again, I would term that as road blocking, where it's just like, what do you want us to do? It's like, what are we supposed to do?
None of us rolled high enough on this check. So what do we do now?
What are we supposed to do?
I hate like, and this,
they put it behind a roll wall. They put the payoff behind a literal roll wall.
That's why, I mean, I don't know how much experience you have running like modules that are pre-written, but some of the original like older modules have a lot of that, where it's like, we followed this path, this is the path we chose, there is a skill check that if you do not make it,
you won't get certain information about
tough shit. There is no way forward now.
You're just
What happened is, I did this when we played Tomb of Annihilation with my Tuesday group, with the DM who, this was his first time running anything. We ran into that a lot, and luckily he was quicker on his feet than I think I gave him credit for, because there were times where I was very frustrated during that campaign where he was like, no, this is how it's supposed to go, And it's like, no, we are
Yeah.
legitimately trying to
Even if
avoid
that's
this.
how
And
it's
that's,
supposed to
you know what?
go.
And you know what? It's unfortunate because I don't think he technically was doing anything wrong
No,
based on
no.
what it was telling him to do.
Technically, he was doing
And
what the book told him to do.
but he eventually figured out that like he had to give us other options, and it did end up being a fun experience overall. And like even we did some things that completely destroyed his storytelling, and like his ability to stick with the book because we were assholes in a jungle. But the reality is that you can't just block. There has to be, as I said, the magic door scenario of like, well, you may have found one part, failed another skill check. I have to now as a DM be like, what other thing could you use? Or if you ask me, hey, could we try this? And I'm like, you know what, maybe I will tweak how this mechanism works just enough so that I could
so
say,
we can keep the story and the game flowing and going well. Because again, here's another thing too, is like, I also do understand that it's like, because obviously there is that whole thing about, it's like, oh, it's also not fun or interesting to be like, to just basically have characters keep making the same check over again
and you know what?
succeed. And
If
so I'm
like me as a DM, if I gave you like two different checks and your party just sucked,
I would say that you
know what?
Yeah, no, I would say you get the initial, like how I like to run is that, you get the initial first check, and then, you can probably get a second check. But if you fail that second check as well, then either depending on what the situation is, you're either not going to be able to do it again for like a long time, or you're going to have to find some other means of actually accomplishing or going through with this. Because you can't just have a game where it's like, oh, these characters can just fail this thing, but then just keep making the check until they succeed. Because then that's also like, in line where it's like, that's where the roadblock is a problem, where it's like, you can't just have a situation or an obstacle be solved by one way, because otherwise that's the only real option you have, is to be like, hey, all right, I guess I'm just gonna keep making this check until I fucking do it. And nobody likes that. Or at least I certainly hope players don't like that, because I don't as a player. I'm like, that's boring as hell, dude.
There's a thing, like, we recently in my Monday campaign, I think this sums this up pretty well, is we were tasked with finding ostensibly a hidden laboratory from this like evil wizard guy who built this thing like 50 years ago. And we were given kind of a ledger from that date, like from that time period, of someone who purchased a bunch of goods, like building materials, like wood, stone, things of that nature, that were delivered to a place in the middle of nowhere and left there. That was what they paid for them to do. There was no setting it up. There was nothing. It was just, leave these materials here. Here's the money up front. There was a very minute paper trail. We had to go find the ledger first of all, because we got information from a group, and we went to the location, and it was like literally the end part of a cliff next to a road. That was where we were sent, and there was nothing there. And we're like, well, how do you get into this thing? And he's like,
is it like an illusion or something?
He's like, well, investigate the area, see what you can come up with. So we did that, and our investigation came up with no illusion, no trick of the mind. It was literally like, there is a physical thing here that you have to find. And we had the idea of, well, this cliff face is hundreds of feet up from the water, so maybe there's something on the side of the cliff. This was a magical individual. They could just fly down there. And that's what we did. We had to go, we could either have lowered someone on a rope or flown and checked. And we had someone lean over the edge and try to see. And we actually saw an indent. We ended up being able to fly into a cave. And it was this whole thing of like, well, now you're in this cave. Where's the laboratory? And there were 3 different ways we could have entered, depending on what skills we used and whatever. And so he gave us enough opportunity that even if we'd failed finding it all together, there was nothing stopping us from maybe trying to find more information elsewhere and coming back at a later date. But you can't just let them keep doing the same thing. But if you give them enough to work off of, eventually they will figure it out. Because there are puzzles, there are things that are difficult.
It should be like, again, about also challenging your players' minds and imagination is really what it is.
Sit there and think for a second.
Expand how they're thinking. It shouldn't just be about like, roll this thing and you automatically get it. To be fair, like I am a person like, excuse me, I like one of the particular skills or aspects that I've also found frustrating at times as a player is when it's like, a DM sets up like a specific thing where it's like, oh, this is clearly a bit of lore or information that we could learn. Oh, but you have to roll like a history check or something. You know, it's like as a player, you know, the whole keeping notes yourself rather than like rolling history, you know, as a character to remember things. I think we talked a little bit about this too before.
Yeah, we did.
And where it's like, you know, and I see both sides of it, and I feel for both sides where it's like, hey, if you're a player who systematically, again, I think as we said before, like checks out of the game because you have, you know, you feel like you can make an excuse to the fact that you have like a high history skill, you know, score, or that you have like the keen mind feat and you're just able to remember shit, and so that automatically then entitles you to check out. No, like that's not okay.
But that's also that's a player issue from a table perspective. It is a
literal. It is a meta. But I will say too, though, it can be a gameplay issue as well. On the other hand, where it's like, okay, you have a player who, like, you know, they're invested in the game. They like the game. They're here. They're role playing. But, you know, maybe they're not the best note takers. Maybe they don't, you know, they can't remember whatever because that's not their best thing. Maybe they don't have a super high intelligence score. That's okay. But, you know, it's like, hey, they're interested and they want to, you know, they're trying to say something or call a bit of lore to maybe whatever. And they're like, DM, can you remind me about this thing or whatever? And
that's
it's like,
okay.
Again,
I think that's fine.
Realistically,
if that engaged
character should know.
Yeah, if they're an engaged person, then you should be able to tell them.
There have been plenty of instances in my experience where like DMs are like, well, if you don't remember it, then your character might not remember. Right? Like roll a history check where you're like, okay, personally, I don't feel like they necessarily should, but you know what? Okay, fine. If you're gonna call for that, then you better make that DC low. It better just be a formality at that.
I think.
Why are you making this a thing where it's like, oh, they somehow have short-term memory loss or something?
Yeah, I think
there's like 2 weeks ago. Like,
yeah, I think that's a major thing, and I'm going to touch upon this real quick because we're already in a tangent, and we'll say this, and then we'll go on to the last ability score. But if this was my full-time job, then maybe I'd remember it all the time. But unfortunately, I see you 3 hours a week, if not 3 hours a month, or every 2 weeks. Or sometimes every 5 weeks.
Whatever your schedule is.
There's no way, even if I wrote this stuff down, I still wouldn't remember how all of it connects. And like, you have to, if I'm engaged while we're at the table, if a player, and this is me as a DM, if you show engagement and you're having a good time and you talk with the other people in the group, if you ask me, hey, I know we did this thing, like we did the recap today and I lost it a little. Or like they in character are in a role play moment and they get a piece of information wrong, I will correct them and be like, hey, is this what you meant to say?
Yeah.
Because if you're saying the wrong thing on purpose, then that's great. And I love that. And let's do a deception check right here and now. But I don't want, and you feel the same way. And I think the majority of people who play this game should most likely do feel the same way. While we're here at this table playing this game that we all collectively want to be a part of
and love,
the last thing that I want to deal with is someone being tricky about information that I should know, because for the last 3 weeks, I haven't been able to think about this.
Yeah. Or for whatever reason, and even more so, it also just boggles my mind at times DMs that act that way. Because once again,
I don't get it.
For me as a DM, like I am like fiending, I'm like foaming at the mouth to get that information to players, right? For players to learn.
I want you to know this.
Especially if they are involved. If they're actively involved, if they're interested, I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait to share this with them. This is gonna be so cool.
That's my Tuesday night stuff is exact. My DM wants you to know.
Yeah, it boggles my mind.
He has these whole background things that happen without your knowledge that he wants you to know about.
Like the whole point is you want to see the reaction from your players upon learning this information, and then see how they're able to utilize and apply that information.
Both the player and the character that they have written.
And the character. Yeah. So, like, why are you deliberately, again, making it that much harder?
Adam, unfortunately, those people are just tyrants that have no other control except this. And that's an unfortunate problem that they're going to have to deal with.
Maybe.
Because
you're probably
if I played the game where someone did that to me, that would be my last session. I don't care how much I liked those people. I would have a conversation with them. If they stay true to their guns, then my character dies next session and I'm out. Because I can't. I can't have someone put
The
that
character
on
can just
me.
leave, Sam. It doesn't have to
No,
die.
they're gonna die. Because if other people at the table love that character, I want them to be sad about me leaving. Both in
That's
character
so
and out.
petty and vindictive. Jesus. They didn't do anything. The DM was the one who was just
That's me,
Oh,
Adam.
I know,
I'm a petty
bud.
bitch.
I know you are. I know, bud. I love you for
That's
it.
my fault. If
I
I'm in
love
a
you
group,
for
I
it.
love the people who are part of it. And if you're gonna be tyrannical with me, I'm not gonna do it.
I understand.
I
get it.
can't.
I do. I really do.
We all have our stipulations. That's my one
We do.
thing.
We do. We all got our lines in the sand
But
that we
keep in
draw.
mind to keeping on the line of being a petty bitch. Let's go into charisma.
Let's go into charisma. Wonderful segue, Sammy.
My favorite
it's
ability.
Many people's favorite attribute overall for all the things it can do.
Let's see. Charisma measures your ability to interact effectively with others. It includes such factors as confidence and eloquence, and it can represent a charming or commanding personality. Charisma checks might arise when you try to influence or entertain others, when you try to make an improvisation. I can't read, evidently, an impression or tell a convincing lie, or when you are navigating a tricky social situation. The deception, intimidation, performance, and persuasion skills reflect aptitude in certain kinds of charisma checks. Now, if you had noticed while I was reading that, my charisma is obviously not very high, but
I would beg to differ, bud. I'd beg to differ.
And
I'm sure many people would.
I think a lot of us who play this game would love to be able to navigate tricky social situations better. So I love having high charisma characters. All of the skills are useful. We'll go over them. I mean,
I think most people do. Who doesn't like to have a character that are just intrinsically likable, right?
Yeah,
I literally,
or not even likable. It doesn't even that's the reality.
I think but that's how a lot of people associate the charisma stat with, especially when they first start out. I had one friend one time. It was one of the first. It was the first long-term form campaign I had ever played in, and she had come in a little bit later on in the campaign, and she had made a Horizon Walker Ranger, I believe in
nice.
I think she was a wood elf or a high elf? I forget. I think she was some kind of elf. But she made like an elf Horizon Walker Ranger, and she pumped the vast majority of her points into charisma. Nice. Of all things, instead of dexterity or wisdom. Like just not even that. Like it was primarily charisma, and then she like allocated everything else relatively equally. And so she had like an 18 in charisma, but only had like a 16 or 15 in dex, like a 12 or something in con, like a 12 in wisdom. And it was I
love it.
It was bad.
Oh wait, that's my warlock that had a 19 intelligence and a 13 charisma.
The issue being is that she would then kind of start complaining about the fact that she was bad in combat, that she couldn't hit anything. And then all the other fun thing, again, to be fair, this was like her first time actually playing.
Yeah, that's when I would have you reallocate.
Like for real. Yeah, and the DM did eventually, because she was complaining about how she could never hit anything. And even more so, her character was not very charismatic. Like she wouldn't talk really. Like she was
so it's like you can't use it.
She was very reserved. She was very like standoffish, like kind of anxious and like not really like engaging in that way. And so yeah, it was all just kind of a mess. And I feel like that in essence is maybe a lot of people's initial idea of charisma, where you're like, oh, if you're charismatic, people just like your character then, right? Because you're just intrinsically charismatic. And it's like, that's not exactly how
you have to
works.
I think this is one of those skills, and the reason I love it so much in D&D is that charisma is almost completely the role play. It is the third pillar.
Oh, it is.
It is the interaction role play pillar. And if you as a person,
well, to a certain extent,
obviously,
I feel like it's almost like a bracer for that pillar. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like a bracer that helps solidify it.
If you as an individual do not attempt to interact with the world around you via role play, your charisma stat, unless it's your casting stat, is not going to
be applicable. It's not going to be applicable.
Like, now there are charisma saves, and there are things it's used for numbers wise. Yes,
very few charisma saves in the game. Usually,
but some of them are Some of them are rough.
Oh no, they're all. That's the thing. That's why there's so few of them. Anything that makes you make a charisma save is usually going to be like game changing in any kind of encounter.
Wisdom and charisma are the roughest.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, intelligence actually recently has been too. True. Like intelligence can literally like knock you out for like a round. Yeah, literally. But I will say I do, to be fair, if a character does have like a high charisma stat, I do think it's fair. I do think it's interesting and flavorful even to basically be like, they are maybe a little bit more intrinsically like attractive or appealing maybe. And
like people might be more interested in them.
Exactly. Like I would say that would then prompt people maybe to talk to them or interact with them more.
I like that.
Because they're more naturally like, charismatic. And I'm be like, okay, but again, if you then don't expand upon that, if you don't take advantage of that, then it's not gonna matter. Yeah. Their interest isn't gonna be maintained indefinitely just because you have a high charisma stat.
No. And that's my Bard in the Jungle scenario with Bard with eloquence or College of Glamour. I was a beautiful motherfucker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who used that charisma.
And again, that's not to say other characters maybe with like not as high charisma aren't also attractive.
No, they 100% can be.
And like in plenty of ways. But it's more so like, hey, if you have this thing and like you said, charisma in and of itself is almost literally like the third pillar of roleplay for the game. It's
and it doesn't mean you can't be good at it without the charisma score. Yeah, and the reality is
if your character is just a charismatic son of a bitch, it makes it easier. Sometimes like, you know what? You don't even have to make a roll. If you said some slick ass shit, dude.
Yeah.
Hell
I almost like to think of charisma as not just with talking. It's also like your force of will.
Yes, that is how that is. And for like spellcasters especially, like that is how they usually define it.
And like obviously we go over the skills and they're pretty straightforward. We'll start with deception. It's whether you can convincingly hide the truth, either verbally or through your action. Deception can encompass everything from misleading others through ambiguity to telling outright lies. Now, this is also like deception would be passing yourself off as someone else or wearing a disguise really well,
which could also be performance too, which we'll get into.
Arguably, it's performance and deception are similar in a lot of ways. Whereas to me, the difference, or if you're a character that does one well over the other, then tell me how you're using that more. Because deception would be, well, I'm trying to get information because to me, it's like deception would be, I'm trying to get information out of this, so I have to tell the lie convincingly. Whereas performance is, I'm just pretending to be another person altogether, not an existing individual. Not passing myself off as a town guard. I'm trying to perform as just a whole other person entirely, and we'll go right into performance just because we're already talking about it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Your performance determines how well you can delight an audience with music, dance, acting, storytelling, or some other form of entertainment. Now, what we were talking about, acting, is one of the main ones I think you can make an argument.
Yeah, for either deception or because again, it is effective. Like there are plenty of people that call acting, you literally lie for a living, right? You are essentially
same thing as serving tables.
Same thing as serving tables. You have to put on a lie, you have to put on a face and act in order to get a certain reaction, a certain job, a certain intention done. And so obviously performance and deception, and even the game itself does say that, where it's really like, it usually does interchange the two. If you have like, say, bonuses to one, usually the other will also kind of be applicable too. Like it usually says that itself for anything that has that.
And then last but not least, we have kind of another two that are intrinsically kind of interchangeable depending on how you do things.
Definitely
intimidation and persuasion. Now, it's the exact same thing. It's your ability to influence someone else to get what you want. One of them is friendly, and one of them is not.
I mean, and well, again, it also depends too, of course, like because. And I think one of the biggest things that we should stipulate, like almost like a disclaimer for this now, is a lot of people, I've heard tons of horror stories, I heard tons of people, I've seen things like this. No matter how charismatic, and I think we also said this at the beginning of this video, no matter how charismatic your character is, no matter how high your persuasion or intimidation, whatever is, that does not automatically mean that what you roll will force somebody to do what you want them to do.
No.
It is not the same as dominating like a person's mind and controlling them actively. Any of this charisma usually is based and predicated on how this individual feels about you themselves already. If they don't like you, or if they're not trying to help you or whatever, no matter what you roll, sometimes no matter what you roll for intimidation or persuasion,
doesn't change the outcome.
It won't change anything. Now, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't at times. Again, it is. No. It's a bit of a thin line to walk, right?
It's the whole point of you might have a chance at changing something,
and I think,
and that's the predicate of you might have a chance. Like, it is depending on the situation and depending on what you have done as a character.
That's what I was going to say.
Depending on how they look at you.
I think maybe the biggest determining factor, at least for me, is how you role play that situation out. Like 100%. that will determine. Like, you can't just say like, okay, well, I want him to tell me the location or whatever. Can I just roll a check to do this? I'm like, no. How are you convincing him? How are you doing this? And again,
because there's so many ways.
How are you intimidating him? How are you convincing him? I will also say, for instance, one of the first games that I ever DM'd for, there was this one friend of mine, again, who, like, she made a fighter, and she took specifically proficiency in persuasion. But again, the funny and irony of it was her character, more often than not, rather than persuading people, we're intimidating them, and also trying to intimidate them into doing things that she wanted them to do, even if they didn't necessarily like her or whatever, or if they're, again, if like, you know, she was a big burly fighter, you know, warrior-esque, and it was like, all right, yeah, you can be intimidating, but these dudes are also these dudes are also big burly fighter dudes who are like, well, all right, you want to fight, let's fight, like, you know, like, you can't. It's not automatically just gonna, being mean to them isn't necessarily the best way to influence this particular individual.
Because there is still such a thing as a social hierarchy in terms of how everyone feels about each other baseline and what you have to do to change that. And now, most of my characters that use intimidation, it's used as the icing on top for threats. And I know some games and some tables, things like torturing, imprisoning, doing messed up things to people is not something that you're going to be able to do at a table. And before you do anything of those things, you need to check with the people you play with. But there's going to be a time where things can get dark or gritty, and things like intimidation or persuasion, if you're doing things like blackmailing, torture, you know, stealing someone's identity, things like that, you can use those things, and there is a better chance of you being successful, but your DM is the one that tells you when you get to roll those skills. You as a player
ask them,
but I think me as a player, I am never going to say, hey, can I roll a persuasion check?
Dude,
no, I wait till the DM, because
no. Here's why I disagree with that, because there are plenty of times where it's just like, once again, it's the same issue as before, where you are trying to push forward, like, the narrative. Like, as a player, you're trying to get information that could be vital or helpful to push forward the narrative. You're trying to do this thing, like, you have done whatever, and, like, again, for whatever reason, the DM is just like, well, that's not the way or the specific kind of thing to do this thing, so we're not going to do that. And it's like, I'm like, okay, and they don't say anything. They're just like, all right, well, she reacts this way, and you're like, okay, can I get some information? Or, like, because again, you wanted to try and get something out of it, you wanted to get a reaction or response, and if the GM is just not being, like, responsive at all, then, you know, I'm like, then I'd be like, can I, like, roll a persuasion check? Did it just automatically fail? Like why did it automatically fail? Again, it's that same mentality where it's like, oh, you automatically fail. You couldn't even try to get this thing, even when you presented a relatively reasonable case. And if the DM, because sometimes I feel like DMs forget about persuasion and intimidation checks, like, because again, you're not controlling them. But if you make a fair, reasonable argument, then that is the point of these. And I feel like plenty of DMs and GMs forget, because they're so focused, again, on running and going a very specific narrative, because these things can often at times throw a bit of a wrench, you know, into a GM's plans, where they're like, oh shit, yeah, that was convincing, and they can make a persuasion check, and then, you know, because you can influence a person. Yes, you know, may not be able to change completely who they are. Like I said, if you're fighting like the BBEG right at the end, and you're trying to be like, hey, step down, man, we're gonna be friends. You're like, okay, you make a good argument, but no, I'm not doing that. We're here now. We're doing this now.
Yeah,
We're
I
fighting. Like, I'm
think
not.
I'll kind of rehash what I meant. Is I don't have to in the games that I play for the most part. There are times
That,
where I have to remind and say, that was my attempt to persuade,
yeah,
but
yes,
I will say
exactly.
this, like, and this is more of a me ass kissing a little bit, is that I'm very lucky to play with the people that I do.
I get it. Yeah.
But the realistic thing is that if you're going to play a character that's good at these things, make it known in one to your DM, and two in your role playing, because these skills don't really come to fruition unless you make the effort. If you're saying, "Oh, I'm good at persuading," and then you don't talk to people in character at a table, then no one's ever going to make you roll persuasion.
Literally, like I said about my other friend in our first campaign, you know, like
No one's going to have you roll, and you're never going to use
did
it.
not really utilize how she built her character. And again, it also comes for she didn't really know how to build a character. She did what she thought was like would be what she wanted, but she didn't really know. And you know, and again, our DM allowed her to reallocate her stuff later on because
Good.
yeah, she wasn't having fun with how it was going because she also just what. But to be fair, it was also kind of her fault because even the things that she did were good at, she just never really utilized. She never tried to do that thing until later on, and she learned, you know.
Yeah.
But that's my biggest thing about this. Like to Sam's point, like you said, I understand, like because I feel like it's a product of like there are on one hand, like I gave the example where like DMs forget that this is a thing, like to ask for, to be like, yeah, roll a persuasion check, or because they don't want you to influence this character, right? It's like DMs can be in a place where they're like, I don't want you to change this character, and like because they're supposed
then they don't change. Like that's the
yeah,
reality.
they
Is
don't have
like
to change, but they can be influenced, maybe,
yeah,
and they
people.
can be influenced if it again if it is for a purpose of progressing the story and your characters or whatever. Then you know maybe it's not the way that you expected it to, but again, that's where improvisation and being able to roll with some of the twists and turns of the game kind of comes into play. Yeah. On the other hand, I do also understand why DMs might be hesitant to allow that kind of thing because you also have people like we said, they have these super skill monkey bards who cannot get lower than like a 27 for persuasion, and anytime you allow persuasion of a character or an NPC, it's like, yeah, I roll a 27. Like, there's no way almost anything or anyone could resist being influenced by that.
There's a thing. Influence doesn't equal an entire change.
It doesn't equal dominance. It doesn't equal control.
I'm going to use an example, and I don't know how familiar you are with To Move Annihilation.
I'm relative.
So there's for the people at home, in To Move Annihilation, there is an individual by the name of Artis Cimber. And he is this like legendary explorer of the jungle who found this ring that is an all-powerful artifact.
It's very
kept him from aging.
ring.
It makes him extremely powerful. Now, my bard was a College of Glamour, so part of my magic is also the influence of people. But this guy didn't really work with others regularly because people would try to take advantage of him or try to kill him, and he didn't want to deal with it. And the reality is that he was so powerful that it wouldn't really matter. But even to just work with this guy, like I rolled well enough on my persuasion and my charisma checks in general that I got him to even sit down at the fire with us and be with us,
interact. Yeah.
And the reality is that I had an ulterior motive, and he made me roll with deception and persuasion at different points in the conversation. I had to actually act, and I ended up casting magic on him, like a glamour effect that allowed me to influence him very little. But the reality is that I had to talk and bring up good points before he even entertained the idea of really interacting with us. Now, I did end up taking the ring from him and killing him, which was not what my DM wanted. And it took like our entire party, and it was terrifying, and we should have died, but it worked out really well for us.
I was gonna say, even if you take the ring off him, he's not dying right away. Like,
well, that was the thing, is like one of us had it was bad. Either way, though, my rolls of charisma did not change his opinion about doing certain things. It's not like I could convince him to give us the ring. That's not something that charisma does. What it does is it maybe changes someone's opinion to, I will never talk to anybody else, to, all right, fine, I'll sit down with these people and see what they have.
That's what I mean. It's like, no, like again, you have to be, in my opinion, within reason, right? Like, it's about
what are the tenets of this character, and how would they maybe be able to influence him, if at all?
And even more so than that, there's almost never going to be any creature in the world that, like, at least, sentient creature in the world that doesn't on some level maybe want to connect with another sentient creature in
Unless
some
they're
way.
just an absolutely evil.
Even if they're evil, they still probably would like to connect in some way. Like, even like, for instance, like red dragons, right? Red dragons are just full of rage. They love destruction, but they love to be worshipped. They love to be lauded. They love to be, like, hailed as basically gods on the earth, right? And so you can interact with them in that way, even if they're evil, even if they are usually the most aggressive of all the dragons, and they're the most likely to kill you aside from like white dragons. It's like, even they can still be interacted with if presented in a certain kind of way.
I mean, you can talk a lich up to his face and be like, no, you are a supreme magical being akin to a god, and they will listen to you because that's what they want to hear.
Like, there are plenty of reasons and ways that you can indeed utilize charisma-based checks to engage with creatures and such. Because even more so, I'll even say, no, maybe you can't, talk the BBEG unless maybe you were like had established a lot of things beforehand, potentially, to do. So, like, you can't talk him out for whatever. But I will absolutely say like a freaking bandit group comes to try and rob you, and you're a group of pretty just dressed and geared up to the nines adventurers, and you make an intimidation check against them, like, y'all better walk the F away, or we will.
Do you really want to try this? Because we both know what's going to happen.
And like, if you roll a high enough, like, it'd be like, you know what? Yeah, you won this encounter without even having to draw a single blade or whatever, because they're not stupid either, right? The bandits aren't idiots. They're not.
Once they see who you are,
yeah, they're not gonna try to just kill somebody or mess with somebody that is, like, pretty clearly, even to them, especially in their line of work, they if they've survived for this long as bandits, they have to have at least some kind of understanding. Now, maybe they might be bad, because they could also, I could say, like, all right, they're going to roll like an insight check to see like how real you're really being, to see like, what is the real threat here, right? Especially if you're going to like lie to them, they're going to do like a deception check. But even then, I'd still maybe like roll for them to see like how smart they are. But if they make a decent check too, it's like, all right, you know what? They're not going to mess with you guys. They're going to move quite a far ways away, actually, just so they don't have to have anything to do with what you're doing.
Or maybe they roll poorly and they do mess with you.
And that's what I'm saying.
And the moment the first one gets turned into a puddle of acid, they're going to be like, oh no.
Oh shiz. And then they run away.
Things like morale.
My monsters as a DM, they will run. Like, they won't stay to freaking die. Like, unless they absolutely have to. Like, they're going to run away.
Morale is something that doesn't come up enough in D&D, and I think charisma.
Agreed. I love
the charisma skill is, and like both charisma and wisdom to a lesser extent, are a part of the morale system. If there's a whole the inspiring leader feat, and like being able to charismatically talk to other people that are on your side or honestly, not on your side. I'd say
all three of the mental attributes could be applicable to morale.
And the reasonable thing to say is, you are not. This isn't a Bethesda video game where if you have a high speech skill, you can talk anyone into anything.
And if you have a low speech skill, you can't convince anyone of anything.
No, like, but it's more about putting points of interest in front of someone in a way that is articulated. And whether or not they listen to it is the DM, but if you're convincing, their opinions can falter or maybe change a little bit.
I feel like, again, charisma, as we literally said 2 other times, charisma is like the brace of the third pillar of D&D, or the second pillar of D&D, which is role playing. And it is literally the ability to reward player engagement and role play. Like, it is a tool in a way for DMs to reward that, to me, in my opinion, where it's like, all right, yeah, you made a really good convincing argument role play wise with your character. That was great. Roll a persuasion check or intimidation or deception. You succeed. All right. You're going to get something cool out of this. Maybe you'll get some information, and you'll feel, again, like you got that spotlight, and you get rewarded with something helpful. You progress the narrative, the story, you help the party. You got something that you wanted, maybe. And again, to be fair, plenty of people try to abuse this. Plenty of people are like, all right, I'm going to lie the pants off this guy to steal everything that he owns. You know what I mean? And it's like,
no.
I mean, it's okay, maybe at certain, depending on maybe who the guy is. If he's an asshole, it's like, all right, you know what? I'll let you maybe try that. If you're like a very attractive individual, once again, if you say the right things, like in role play, yeah, maybe you can. This guy isn't necessarily like, he's not like a super like adept or whatever guy. He's underestimating you. He doesn't necessarily see you as a threat. Like, you know,
the easiest way to put this is there's a difference between scamming somebody on the street and scamming a lord of a city.
yeah.
Yeah,
You can't just convince a king to be like, I'm going to sign away my entire kingdom to you.
No,
You're now the new monarch. Like,
but let's be real. If you're crafty enough, you might be able to put yourself in good standing with someone in power. And once they realize after the fact that what you did, there might be a respect there, even if it was maybe not the most, straightforward way of doing that thing. You can, like, there are in history, there have been charismatic people that make their way onto a court of power just because they're
charismatic.
They are a silver-tongued individual.
They know how to talk, bro. They know how to say the right shit.
There's an example of like your DM, if they're just shutting that down completely, have a conversation, because not everyone can be convinced of something, but there is something to be said for someone who is articulate and good at talking.
If they are charismatic,
yeah, there is a likability there.
Give them that capacity to be rewarded again for their engagement and active
role play. Yeah, if you tell them straight up, like, look, this is a person that you're not going to be able to change their ways completely. That is a realistic thing in both real world and fantasy worlds. Yeah. That is an acceptable answer.
You can't just change who a person is intrinsically and what they believe just because you said something really.
But you might change how they look at you. Yeah. And that is an important tool.
Yes, that can be super important and super influential.
Because if you make yourself look trustworthy and you make yourself look like you're capable and you know what you're doing through your tongue, through your speech, then you may have other doors open to you.
You know what? I have an even great example. It's like, again, maybe you can't talk that BBEG down from a fight, but depending on what you said, depending on the relationship and the dynamics that you have established throughout the time and the things that you've said, it's like, even if you still fight each other, hell, even if you lose, he might end up still feeling bad about it, and your sacrifice might still, and your words before might still ring true in his ears. And maybe then, after he sees, he's killed you guys, maybe he ended up winning, and maybe you could change him after that. Yeah. You couldn't change him right there in that moment. He couldn't stop the fight, but those words that you spoke to him could still resound and influence in his head. And maybe after a while, he begins to see things after what you said and did. And maybe even though you lost to him in the fight, maybe you still accomplished what you wanted, and he changes his ways eventually or something for the better. Like,
yeah, but that also requires a lot of work for the DM.
It does. Well, I mean, it depends, because obviously, again, if it's like the finale and you're like, this is the final fight and the boss or whatever, and it's just like, oh, hey, like, what are we gonna, like, this is the epilogue and kind of what happens and stuff, like, because it's like, even more so, like, again, my point being though is like that in essence shows even though you can't necessarily just make any shit that you want happen, doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to role play and be engaged and be immersed. That's also a word we love here on the Arcane Archive. Immersion. We're all about it. We love it. That is what it should be about. If you presented this and there's like a potential conflict, utilize the skills of charisma to help alleviate or momentarily remove that conflict, to help progress the story and ingratiate your players in the world. Like, it's again, I feel like it all just comes back to, again, like, DMs don't, I like Sam, selectively say no. Me and Sam are always like, be very specific and selective about what players can't do, but don't ever just shut them down and say, no, you can't do that. If it's something that's reasonable, don't get so caught up in your own head and your own, like, minutia on the way you feel the way things should be going in your game, that you literally end up like caging all of your players' imagination and attentiveness and ideas, creativity, and their engagement. Because I guarantee you, you constantly say no, they're gonna start to check out, and that's the worst thing in a D&D game, where you start having your players and anybody, even your GM especially, would be even worse. Like, you have anybody in your game start to check out, because then it'll just be a slow, steady decline where it's just gonna crumble. It's just gonna crumble.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
But
Because there's a lot of like, if you don't, you have to at least let people try and kind of think about,
for the most
stuff like
part,
that.
for the most part, there are certain things, like, obviously, if it's like, oh, I want to kill my party members, while they're sleeping or whatever, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, but you're gonna, you can maybe allow that, but you should also then maybe give the other party members, ample opportunity or ability to react and to whatever with that. And again, I think if that particular scenario were ever to occur, if I was to allow that in any way, shape, or form, the player who is instigating would have to give me a damn good reason for why they are now instigating this like sneaky, like, PvP moment here. Like, if there's ever going to be any kind of PvP in my game, you better give me that's like malicious in nature, and not like maybe just like sparring. You better give me a really damn good reason,
Yeah,
why you're doing this.
I'd say the only instances of that in any of the games I played were always within role play. So it wasn't a out of game, it was an in game, like, my character is not okay with this. And it ended that way too. It wasn't
we'll say it. There are indeed some scenarios and situations where what my character would do is actually okay to say,
it's an inter-party conflict is the thing.
It is,
especially if you have if you have people from different walks of life with different ideals,
opinions, thoughts, beliefs, all that stuff. It's like, yeah, it'll happen, and that's all right. But you one thing, again, the issue being is you cannot do some messed up, screwed up shit and then try to like justify your actions after the fact by being like, well, that's what my character would do. So it's like, well, then this is what their characters would do. They would kill you then. Your character is gone now. Make a new character who wants to come along with the party and wants to be with the party,
Yeah, because what's the word? I'll give an example. In one of my games, we had two characters. I played one of them who just did not like each other. From the inside of meeting one another, they'd make comments and bicker and like to the point of like insults and things like that back and forth. And it got to a breaking point where one of them made a comment that was like too far. And the character attacked the other character, and they got into a fight. And of course, both of them were magic, but it was like a fist fight where it was just cantrips. There was no big spells or anything like that.
Yeah.
To the point, and it happened like in the middle of a town, to the point where town guards were like, "If you don't stop, if you don't stop, you're not only you're both arrested, you're both going to jail for an extended amount of time because you're causing damage. You could hurt someone." And it was this point of like after it all happened, we both cooled off. Obviously, I made sure. As player to player that we were good. He said, "Oh no, we're good." He's like, "I'm still in character right now. I have a hard time, But it was one of those things of like we still don't like each other, but to the point now where we have worked together on things, and our characters' opinions of each other have changed. And it's one of those things that's okay.
That's vital. That is the vital aspect. Again, like Sam said, inter-party conflict or issues are perfectly fine. It's what makes your characters was the party multidimensional and more dynamic. That's awesome. But one thing I would say is that if there's ever going to be anything like that, the communal objective should always be to get to a point where your characters can cooperate. Maybe they don't have to like each other. They don't have to be best friends necessarily. But they should the point is to get to a place where they at least have mutual respect and cooperation, because that's the point of the game.
And I'm gonna make this, and I think we've talked about this before, whether it was on or off camera, but there is a thing with D&D where, because you're working with a group, sometimes your individual character, the ideals you gave them when you made them, and your goals do not align with the group anymore. Whether it's because people have died and you've picked up new characters, whether or not it's because new information was found, and you just can't you can't justify working with a group of people who have such different ideals than you, then have your character leave. There isn't like this has happened in multiple games I've played where a character they just didn't align anymore, and it wasn't out of hatred.
No,
It was more of the
if your
fact that
character can't jive, then
we had
work
a
on
time
by.
where we literally had a two-party game. So we had like a party A, party B, and both parties had characters from the original party, and both parties had new characters that they picked up on their way to do the quest that they needed to do. Because sometimes your ideals do differentiate, and that's okay. But you know what? It shouldn't be a malicious thing.
No,
It should be
you
like,
should never
hey,
get violent.
I want to, and
unnecessarily.
talk to your DM, talk to their players, and be like, hey, unfortunately, like my character needs to do this thing,
Yeah,
and it just doesn't align, and we don't
it
have the
doesn't
time.
align. Yeah, what's going on? So I'm cool with having them kind of go their separate ways at least, and it doesn't even have to be forever, right?
No, that's what it was for us. It ended up coming back.
Yeah.
So like my character actually followed one of the characters because they were indebted to them, and we left a note for the rest of the party like, hey, we know that you're heading to this place.
We can't go there.
We're
right
sorry,
now.
we can't. We have to go somewhere else, and I hope that you can, find people to work with. And we ended up creating secondary characters that they found in a different location, and we played them for a while. And now, like, I think everyone at the table has more than one character that's technically in universe doing something.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But make sure you talk to your DM and you make sure,
and your players, your fellow players, like that. Again, in this regard, in any of these examples, communication is absolutely key. It's absolutely integral and vital to be able to doing anything like this. Like this is, it's I mean, that's just life, ironically, right there too, man. Like even just in any aspect, communication, any kind of relationship, interpersonal relationship in any kind of way, like you gotta make sure you freaking communicate.
Yeah.
And that in essence, that's charisma, man. That is charisma.
It's communication.
It's very much, it's highly communication. There's obviously said force of will, of course. It's that innate, natural, ability and whatnot. But overall, it's about your communication. And I for one always feel like communication should be rewarded. But yeah, I think y'all, in essence, that's about all we really had to talk about on today's incredible installment of Arcane Archive MetaTalks. We thank you all, as always, so much for coming along with us. We hope you enjoyed or found this to at least be slightly educational, entertaining, or if you hated it, hey, glad to get that rage porn going for you. There you go. But otherwise, once again, thank you all so much for coming and being here with us. We wish you guys a great rest of your day. Feel free to check out, again, all the rest of our videos. We always love to talk about all kinds of things. They're great, super fun. And we'll see you guys real soon in the next one. So long.